The inner part of the arch was painted with majestic murals depicting that event, and rose to a dome so high a microclimate of clouds regularly formed under the apex. I had known Spatian personally, and like several others in the procession, I paused under the giant gate to pay my respects to the eternal flame. No, that is not true. I had known Spatian during the Helican Schism, but not at all well. For reasons I could not explain, I felt compelled to stop. I certainly had no great urge to honor him. "Sir?" Ravenor asked as I stepped aside. "Go on, I'll catch up shortly," I told him. Ravenor moved on with the procession while I lit a votive candle and set it amongst the thousands of others around Spatian's tomb. The vast tide of the triumph moved slowly by behind me. Other figures had detached themselves from the procession and stood nearby, paying silent homage to the Admiral. "Eisenhorn?" I looked round, the voice breaking my reverie. An elderly but powerful Navy officer stood before me, splendidly austere in his white dress jacket. "Madathine," I said, recognizing him at once. We shook hands. It had been a few years since I'd seen Ulm Madathine, Lord Procurator Madathine, as he was now. We'd first met at Gudrun during the Necrochuk affair, when he had been a mid-ranking officer in the Battlefleet Disciplinary Detachment, the Navy's military police. Now he ran that detachment. He'd been a useful and reliable ally over the years. "Quite an event," he said, with a reserved smile. Outside, the horns of the immense Titans blared again, and the noise from the crowd swelled. "I find myself sufficiently humbled," I said. "The War Master must be loving it." He nodded. "Uplifting. Good for public morale." I agreed. But in truth, my heart was not in it. It wasn't just the overwhelming cacophony of it, or my deep-seated reluctance to be here at all. Since Ravenor and I had stepped out to take our place in the triumph, I had nursed a sense of foreboding that was growing with each passing minute. What was it had made me pause here, under the great arch? "There's a look on your face," said Madathine. "This isn't really your thing, is it?" "I suppose not." "What is it, old friend?" I paused. Something. I strode back to the south arch of the Spatian Gate and looked back down the huge river of the Triumph. Madathine was with me. The War Master's retinue was just then beginning to pass under the gate. Cymbals and horns clashed and blared. The noise of the crowd boomed in like a tidal wave surging down. There were petals in the air. I remember that clearly. A blizzard of loose petals gusting up from the flowers the crowd was strewing. A formation of 12 lightnings was swooping in low from the south, coming down the length of the Triumph Parade, following the avenue of the Victor Bellum, coming towards the gate. They were in line abreast, the tips of their forward-swept wings almost touching, a display of perfect formation flying from the battlefleet's best pilots. Sunlight glinted on their canopies and on the raked double vanes of their tailplanes. The sense of foreboding I had felt now became oppressively real. It was like heavy clouds had passed in front of the sun. "Ulm, Emperor's mercy! He's in trouble! Look!" Madathine cried. The fighters were half a kilometer from the gate, moving at a high cruising speed. The left-hand wingman suddenly wobbled, bucked, and veered. The flyer directly inside of him pulled hard to avoid a collision, and his starboard wing clipped the wingtip of the next lightning in line. There was a bright puff of impact debris. One by one, like pearls coming off a necklace, each aircraft was knocked out of the formation. The once sleek line broke in utter disarray. Madathine hurled me to the ground as the jets shrieked overhead, rattling the world with their afterburners. The two that I had seen strike each other were spinning in the air, somersaulting like discarded toys, splintering trails of metal scrap behind them. In the confusion, it seemed to me as if several others had also accidentally collided. One lightning, over 10 tons of almost supersonic metal, cartwheeled down and went into the crowd on the west side of the avenue. It bounced at least once, showering human debris into the air. At its final impact, it became a massive fireball that belched up a blazing mushroom cloud 100 meters into the air. Shock and berserk panic filled the crowd. The stench of flame and heat and promethium washed over me. There was a flash, and the ground shook as a second stricken lightning spiraled in under the shadow of the gate. Then, almost simultaneously, a third and louder blast came as a third aircraft, sent lurching out of control, sheared off a wing on the top corner of the Spatian Gate itself, right above us, and began tumbling down, end over end. In the face of this calamitous accident, the soldiers in the Triumph were scattering in all directions. I dragged Madathine back in under the arch as shattered chunks of the stricken aircraft avalanched down. A catastrophe. A terrible, terrible catastrophe. And it was just beginning. Chapter 6. Doom comes to Thracian. Chaos unslipped. Headshot. Even at that stage, gripped by horror and outrage, I knew that a great hollow part of me deep in my soul could not, would not, believe that this has simply been a tragic accident. There were fire and explosions all around, mass panic, screaming, and another sound, an extraordinary low moaning, a swelling, surging susurration that I realized was the sound 2 billion people make when they are panicking and in fear for their lives. The crowds had spilled over onto the avenue, quite beyond the measure of the arbites to contain them, fleeing both the dreadful crash sites and the fires, and also the imagined risk that to stand still somehow invited more Imperial warcraft to fall upon their heads. The crowd moved as one, a fluid thing, like water. There was no decision-making process, no ringleader. Mass instinct simply compelled the people who swamped the vast street in awful trampling tides, overwhelming the ranks of the Triumph, much of which was already breaking up in shocked dismay. There was no sound of music anymore, no cheering, no drums or sirens. Just a braying insanity, a world turned on its head. I saw people die in their hundreds, trampled underfoot or crushed in the sheer press of bodies. In some cases, the dead were so squeezed by their neighbors, they were carried along for many meters before being freed to slither to the ground. I saw troopers from the retinues and arbites firing to the crowd in terror before they were run down. Barricades collapsed. Standards swayed and toppled. Walkways over the drain canals alongside the avenue cracked and fell in, spilling hundreds down into the rock-creek trenches. I'd lost sight of Madathine in the pandemonium. I tried to push out from the arch into the sunlight, but fleeing bodies slammed into me. The entire approach to the Spatian Gate was a mass of twisted wreckage and fire from the impact high above. Several dozen guardsmen lay twisted and dead amid the wreckage, killed by falling metal and stone, their dress uniforms dusted white with powdered etherite or scorched by fire. Through the sea of screaming humanity, I could see several of the massive Orocotheres, stampeding out of control, rearing up, shaking their riders from their backs, trampling into the multitude. Lifeless bodies were tossed high into the air by their swishing tails. I managed to slide along the outer edge of the gate until I could look north, towards the distant monument of the Ecclesiarch. Right along the wide avenue, the scene was repeated. The procession of the Triumph was overrun by the sheer numbers of the terrified public. There was fire, too, great plumes of it, rising from the crowd spaces on either side of the road in 3 places, and on the avenue of the Victor Bellum itself, about 700 meters beyond the gate. It also seemed to me that fire rose from other open areas beyond the next spire, off the roadway into the artisans' quarter. By my estimation, at least 5 more of the stricken lightnings had fallen from the sky, ripping into the mass of the citizenry, teeming in panic on the avenue. Soot and ash fogged the air. Distantly, above the milling nightmare of bodies, I could see the vast shapes of the Titans, turning on their metal hips, hesitant, as if utterly confused. I doubt I saw the other lightnings before anyone else, but I was transfixed. They were all I could see. There were 4 more of them, presumably the only survivors of the disastrous flyby. They had turned and were sweeping back down the avenue. Their formation was nothing like as precise or pretty as it had been just before the accident, but they were much lower and much faster. And I knew what that meant, for I had seen it before. An attack run. Emperor, spare me. My heart almost stopped as I saw the insane intention taking shape before me. I screamed out something, but it was futile. One voice against 2 billion. Streams of tracer rounds spat from the heavy cannons under their noses. Wing-mounted las cannons sparkled soundlessly. 2 went low over the crowd, slaughtering thousands. The other 2 followed the avenue itself, raking the great Triumph. The destruction was extraordinary, as if invisible white-hot ploughs had been set into the sea of bodies, slicing long, straight, explosive furrows out of the imperial citizenry below. Or as if some fast-moving, burrowing force was scattering them from below. Stippled lines of explosions soared through the populace, casting up both human and mechanical wreckage. There was an actual fog of liquefied tissue in the air. I saw tanks struck on the highway, detonating in the mob. Hundreds of guardsmen and space marines in the ruined cavalcade opened fire into the air, chasing the planes, churning the sky with bright, crisscrossed lines. A lightning swept by almost overhead, cutting to the left of the Spatian gate. Its strafing firepower explosively mangled hundreds of people perilously close to me, showering me and the white stone of the gate's side face with cooked blood. Hundreds of batteries in the procession were now firing into the sky, the hydras blitzing the air. Even tanks were firing, out of anger, I suppose, for they hadn't a hope in hell of hitting the fast-moving aircraft. Yet something must have struck. A second lightning tilted as it passed over the gate, tiny explosions shredding its left wing and tail section. It dove straight down into the avenue itself. It hit what seemed to me to be the heart of the War Master's section of the Triumph. The blast wake blew out across the wide roadway, killing as many with its concussive effects as with the impact fireball itself. The three remaining lightnings banked again down over the far end of the avenue and made for a third pass. I was struck by the way they didn't turn as a pack. They flew individually, as if divorced from the world. Were their pilots possessed? Insane? My mind span. Two of them banked into each other and almost hit. One didn't veer and carried on up the avenue, hungry for more carnage. The other was forced to swing wide, corrected, and turned over the wailing crowd mass to the west of the avenue. The third overshot and almost disappeared. I saw it loop far away, out over the river haze, its wings glinting in the sun. Then it, too, came back for us. Like the others, straight back, heedlessly, into the teeth of the firestorms that the tanks, hydras, and infantry were throwing up at them. Several hundreds more died in that final run. Loyal citizens whose exciting day out had turned to horror. Proud guardsmen, back from the war, thinking only to enjoy this special hour of praise. Mysterious space marines, who were there only because they had been invited to be there, as an expression of honor, who perhaps greeted this death as just an alternative to their expected fate. Imperial nobles and dignitaries died in their hundreds. Several noble households never recovered from the losses at the triumph of Thracian. The last three lightnings fell in this manner. One, crossing the Spatian gate and beyond, was blown apart in an airburst by tracking hydras on the chaotic street. A second flew the gauntlet of anti-air salvos without adjusting its height, and then, struck by one of the guns almost as an afterthought, turned upside down in a lazy yaw. Streaming smoke, it tilted down towards the ground, but exploded against the monument of the ecclesiarch. The third came in, guns chattering, and actually flew under the arch of the Spatian gate. By then, the Titans themselves had turned to engage, and my guts convulsed with the subsonic roar of their weapons. I could see them, 3 kilometers away, weapon mounts pumping and flashing high above the crowd. Excelsis Gaudi, one of the warlord Titans, caught it dead on and killed it in the air, but not cleanly enough. The tumbling lightning, ablaze from end to end, hit the immense warlord Titan square on and decapitated the colossus as it exploded. I was lost. I was stupefied. I was speechless. I felt as if I should fall to my knees amid the tumult and beg the God Emperor of mankind for salvation. But my part in this was only just beginning. Pellucid blue flame, like a searing wall of acid, suddenly washed through the churning mob behind the gate. Men, women, soldiers, civilians were caught in it and shuddered, melting, resolving into skeletons that turned to dust and blew away. I felt the pain in my sinuses, the throb in my spine. I knew what it was. Psyche evil. Raw chaos, loosed on this world. The prisoners were loose. The warriors did not matter. A vast, pitched battle was already raging across the avenue behind Spatian's broken gate. The Thracian Guard, the Aurora Marines, and the Arbites were striving to contain the outbreak of enemy prisoners, many of whom had taken the opportunity to break free and grab weapons. A ferocious, point-blank war had seized the great approach. But what concerned me were the Psychers. The captured heretics, the 33, they had broken free. I drew my power sword and my bolt gun, plunging into the milling bodies, crunching over the calcified bones of those slaughtered by the psychic wave. An inhuman thing, a chaos prisoner, leapt at me, and I struck its head off with my blade. I leapt over a dead space marine who was leaking blood onto the rockcrete from splits in his Imperator armor and pushed through the howling civilians. 4 Thracian guardsmen were directly ahead of me, using the charred corpse of a fallen Orocothere for cover as they blasted into the press. I was a few steps away from them when the gigantic dead animal reanimated, a psychic puppet, killing them all. My weapons were useless. I focused my mind and blew the thing apart with a concussive mental wave. An Aurora Marine flew through the air over me, 10 meters up, his legs missing. I ran on, scything my blade at the escaped prisoners who menaced me. The road was covered with the dead. Humans, on fire from head to foot, stumbled past me and collapsed on their faces. The Trojan tractor team was on fire, its massive trailer slewed around. 3 of the enemy psychers lay dead on the payload space, and 4 void shields remained intact, their occupants frantic within. But the others, upwards of 25 Alpha-level enemy psychers had escaped. I saw the first, a stumbling, emaciated wretch of a man, near the end of the trailer. Corpuscent flickered around his head, and he was trying to eat a screaming astropath novitiate. My bolt gun stopped his demonic work. I dropped to my knees, gasping and crying as the second found me. She was a stringy female, clad in a gauzy white veil, her fingernails like talons. She cowered behind the end of the trailer, sobbing and lashing out at me with her foul power. She had no eyes. I am not Alpha class. My brain was broiling and bubbling. A Thracian guardsman ran at her from the left, and instinctively she turned her attention to him. His head popped like a blister. I shot her through the heart and knocked her flat on her back. Her limbs continued to thrash for over a minute. Electrical discharge spat out at me from nearby in the crowd. People, screaming and burning, tumbled frantically back from a male psyker who was striding head down towards the hives. He was a dwarf, with stunted limbs and an enlarged cranium. Ball lightning crackled around his pudgy fingers. I stabbed at him with my mind, just to get his attention, and then exploded his face with a pinpoint bolt. Emperor saved me. He kept coming. I had blown the front off his skull, but he kept coming. Blind, his features a gory mess, he stumbled across the ground towards me, his still active mind boring into mine. I fired again, almost panicking myself, and blew off one of his arms. Still, he came on. My jacket, hair, and eyelashes caught fire. My brain was about to explode out of my skull. A space marine in the colors of the Aurora chapter came at him from behind and shredded him into pulp with his bolt gun. "Inquisitor," the space marine asked me, his voice distorted by his helmet mic. "Are you all right?" He helped me up. "What insanity is this?" he rasped. "You have a Vox channel. Alert Lord Orsini." "Already done, Inquisitor," he crackled. Behind us, the tractors exploded en masse, flinging fire and debris high into the air. A scalded child ran past us, shrieking. The space marine grabbed the child in his massive arms. This way, out of danger." "No," I said slowly. Don't! His visored face swung up at me in confusion, the child cradled in his arms. "Don't what?" he asked. "Look at the brand, the mark there," I yelled, pointing to the Malleus rune, burned into the child's ankle. The hammer of witches, the brand mark of the Psyker. The Chaos child looked up at me and grinned. "What mark?" asked the Space Marine. "What mark are you talking about?" I tried to fight it. Please know that. I tried to repel the unholy power of the child's mind as it groped into my head. But this thing, this child, was far beyond my powers to contain. "Kill him," it said. My hand was shaking, resisting, as I swung the bolt gun around and shot the Space Marine through the head. A searing white agony flooded my horrified being. "Now, kill yourself," it suggested, chortling. I put the smoking muzzle of the bolt gun against my own temple, my vision filled with the giggling face of the child, perched on the knee of the collapsed, headless Space Marine. "That's it. Go on." My finger tightened on the trigger. No. "Yes, you stupid fool. Yes." Blood streamed out of my nose. I wanted to fall to my knees, but the monster wouldn't let me. It wanted me to do one thing and one thing only. It implored me, ripping my consciousness apart. It was strident, and it was undeniable. I pulled the trigger. Chapter 7. Voke and Speculations. Esaradon. Through the Void. But I did not die. The bolt gun, that gift from Librarian Britnoth, which had never failed me in 10 decades of use, failed to fire. The child thing shrieked and leapt away into the smoke and flames and struggling shapes around me. The dead space marine toppled over. The air frothed with psychic discharge, and 3 figures ran past me in pursuit of the tiny abomination. Inquisitors. All 3 were Inquisitors, or interrogators at least. One, I was sure, was Inquisitor Lyco. I lowered my shaking hand. Both it and the bolt gun it clutched were cased in psionic ice. The mechanism jammed and locked out. I turned and found Commodus Voke standing a few paces behind me. His ancient face was contorted with internal pressure. Crusts of sympathetic frost glittered on his long black gown.
"Point it aside,"
his words came out as halting gasps.
"I cannot hold it much longer."
Swiftly, I turned the bolt gun aside and up into the air. With a barking gasp, he convulsively relaxed, and the weapon bucked and fired. The deadly round whined away harmlessly into the sky. Voke was sagging, the gyros in the augmetic exoskeleton that cradled his frail body, straining to manage his balance. I gave him my hand in support. "Thank you, Commodus."
"No matter,"
he said, his voice a whisper. His strength began to return, and he peered up at me with his bird-bright eyes.
"Only a brave man or a fool tangles with a plus-alpha psyker."
"Then I'm both or neither. I was closest to the emergency. I could not just stand by." We were assailed by extraordinary noises from the charnel ground behind us. Gunfire, grenades, screams, and the popping, surging sounds of mines fracturing reality, compressing matter, boiling atmosphere. I saw a robed man, an inquisitor or an astropath, rising slowly into the sky in a pillar of green fire, burning, shredding inside out. I saw geysers of blood like waterspouts, squalls of hail and acid rain, localized to this small stretch of the avenue, blustered across us, triggered by the ferocity of the psychic war. Figures were rushing in to join that battle, many from the Ordos with their expert bodyguards, and dozens of the Adeptus Astartes. There was a vibration underfoot, and I saw that one of the towering warhound titans was stalking past the Spatian gate, spitting its turbo lasers at ground targets. A series of withering explosions, mainly psychoblasts, tore through the habitats and hive structures on the eastern side of the wide and now infamous avenue. Imperial marauders flashed low overhead. The sky was black with smoke, all sunlight blotted out. Wisps of ash fell on us like grey snow.
"This is a great crime," Voke said to me. "A black day in the Imperial annals."
I had forgotten how much Commodus Voke loved understatement. The greater part of Hive Primaris remained lawless and out of control for 5 days. Panic, rioting, looting, and civil unrest boiled through the streets and hab levels of the wounded Megapolis as the Arbites and the other organs of the Imperium struggled to impose martial law and restore order. It was a desperate task. The indigenous population alone was vast, but it had been swelled to an unimaginable extent by pilgrims and tourists for the Novena. Sympathetic panic riots broke out in other hives too. For a day or two, it seemed like the entire planet was going to collapse in blood and fire. Small sections of Hive Primaris had managed to insulate themselves. The elite spire levels, the noble houses, built like fortresses, the impregnable precincts of the Inquisition, the Imperial Guard, the Astropathicus, the various bastions of the Munitorum, and the royal palace of the Lord Commander. Elsewhere, especially in the common and general hab levels, it was like a war zone. The ecclesiarchy suffered particularly gravely. With the monument of the ecclesiarch in flames, the common masses regarded the nightmare as some holy curse, and turned in their frenzy on all the churches, temples, and sacerdotal orders they could find. We learned within the first few hours that Cardinal Palatine Andalusius had been killed in the destruction of the monument. He was far from the only great hierarch to perish in the orgy of carnage that followed. The recapture or extermination of the remaining rogue psychers was the first and most fundamental task facing the authorities. 10 were known to have escaped the initial battle on the avenue of the Victor Bellum, and these had fled into the hive, sowing carnage as they went, hunted by the forces of the Inquisition and all the imperial might that could be brought to bear in support. 2 of them made it only a kilometre or 2 from the route of the procession, hounded every step by imperial forces from the avenue battle, and were neutralized by nightfall on that terrible first day. Another went aground in a vegetable cannery in an eastern sector outhab and was laid to siege. It cost 3 days and the lives of 800 Imperial Guardsmen, 62 astropaths, 2 Space Marines, and 6 Inquisitors to blast it out and burn it. The cannery and the outhab for 3 square kilometers around it was flattened. There was little or no central control for our forces. Admiral Otron, who had remained with the orbiting battle fleet as watch commander, managed to move 4 picket ships into geosynchronous orbit above Hive Primaris, and for a while succeeded in providing comprehensive Vox and astropathic communications for the ground forces. But by nightfall on the first day, psychic storms had blown up across the Hive, and all relayed reception was lost.
Commander, I was wondering when
It was a dark and frightening period. Down in the burning streets, we subdivided as best we could into small units, functioning autonomously. Simply by dint of being with Vogue, I became part of a group that made its headquarters in an RBT section house on Blammerside Street in the Mercantile District. Desperate groups of citizens flocked to us, craving aid and mercy and sanctuary, and much larger gangs attacked the section house time and again, driven by fear, by rage against the imperial machine, or simply because we wouldn't let them in. We couldn't. We were overflowing with injured and dead, far too many for the RBT's surgeons and morgue attendants to manage. There was very little food, medical supplies, or ammunition left, and we were also rationing water, as the main supply had been cut. The power was down too, but the section house had its own generator. All through the night, bottles and missiles and promethium bombs splintered off the shielded windows, and fists pounded on the doors. By merit of his seniority, Vogue was in command. Aside from myself, there was Inquisitor Roban, Inquisitor Yelena, Inquisitor Esadari, 20 interrogators and junior servants of the Inquisition, 60 troopers from the Interior Guard, several dozen astropaths, and 4 White Consul Space Marines. The RBTs themselves numbered around 150, and the section house was also sheltering about 300 nobles, ecclesiarchs, and dignitaries from the Great Triumph, as well as a few hundred common citizens. I remember standing alone in a ransacked office of the RBT's commander just after midnight, looking out through shielded windows at the burning streets and the blossoms of psycho storms that were wrenching the sky apart. I had received no word or sign of Ravener since the catastrophe had begun. I remember my hands were shaking even then. In truth, I believe I was in shock. From the event itself, naturally, and also from the psychic assaults I had suffered in the course of it. I pride myself on a sharp mind, but there was no sharpness to me then. Numb, my brain kept returning to the idea that this outrage had been deliberate.
There is no question,
Vogue said from behind me, clearly reading my surface thoughts without my permission. He lifted and straightened a steel chair and sat down on it.
Accidents happen. Warplanes crash, he cried. But these turned and attacked. Their assaults were deliberate.
I nodded. At least one of the lightnings had crashed into the War Master's entourage, and another had come down amongst the files of the Inquisition. No one yet knew how many of my institution had been slain, but Vogue had seen enough of it to know that as many as 200 of our fellow Inquisitors had been obliterated. I remembered the conversation that had turned around my dining table, the speculations about those powerful forces who would oppose Honorius's bestowment. Is this the first act in a house war? I said. The ecclesiarchy, or perhaps great dynasties, trying to thwart Lord Commander Helicon's advancement of the War Master. His elevation to feudal protector would not have been popular with many powerful factions.
No, he said, though I'm sure that's what many will think. What many will be supposed to think.
Vogue looked at me intently.
Freeing the Psychers was the point, he said. There is no other explanation. The arch-enemy struck to cause mayhem and allow the prisoners to escape, and to wound the section of the parade that was most able to contain their escape.
I won't argue with that in principle, but was freeing the Psychers the point itself, or simply a means to an end?
How so?
Was it an attempt to liberate the Psychers, or was this just an act of extreme violence against the Imperium that the release of dangerous Psychers was meant to exacerbate?
Until we know what was behind it, we can't answer that.
Could the Psychers themselves have done it? Manipulated the minds of the pilots?
He shrugged. We can't know that either. Not yet. The War Master might have been guilty of bravado in displaying his prisoners, but he would have made certain security around them was seamless. I must suspect an outside hand.
We said nothing for a moment. Honorius Magnus himself had barely survived the crash blast and was undergoing emergency surgery aboard a medical frigate at the Navy Yard. No one yet knew if Lord Commander Helicon was alive. If he was dead, or if the War Master died of his injuries, then Chaos would have won a historic victory. I suspect an outside hand, too, I told Vogue. Perhaps another Psyker or Psychers trailing their colleagues here to stage an escape. He pursed his lipless mouth.
The greatest triumph of my life, Gregor, capturing those monsters in the name of the Emperor. And look what it becomes.
You can't blame yourself for this, Commodus.
Can I not?
He squinted at me.
In my place, how would you feel?
I shrugged.
I will make amends. I will not rest until every one of these wretches is destroyed and order restored. And then I will not rest until I find who and what was behind it.
He stared at me for a long time. What? I asked, though I had a feeling I knew what was coming.
You. You were close to the scene, as you said to me. Closer than many, and shielded from the worst of the destruction by the bulk of the Spatian Gate.
And?
You know what I want to ask you.
You thought you'd start with me. I'm too tired, Vogue. I stopped to honor the Admiral's tomb. He raised one eyebrow, as if he sensed I didn't really believe it myself. But at least he did me the courtesy of not ripping into my mind with his much more powerful psychic abilities to scour out what truth might be there. We had reached an understanding through our encounters over the years, and were now even when it came to owing each other our lives. He knew me well enough not to press this. Not now, at least. An interrogator hurried into the room. "Sirs," she said, "Inquisitor Roban wishes you to know that we have made contact with one of the heretics." As far as could be learned, the rogue was an Alpha-Plus Psyker called a Saradon, one of the leaders of the Coven. Sowing tumult and woe in his wake, he had fled into the hive with a group led by Lyco and Heldane in pursuit. Heldane had managed to contact one of Vogue's astropaths with a scrambled summons for help. Vogue, Roban, and I headed out into the hive streets with a kill team of 60 that included the 4 white consoles. Their squad leader was a particularly large sergeant called Curvel. We travelled on foot through the debris and smoke. Gangs of citizens jeered and pelted missiles at us, but the sight of 4 terrible space marines kept them at bay. A Saradin, Vogue warned me, was a being of dreadful intellect and not to be underestimated. When we saw the monster's choice of bolt hole, I understood what Vogue meant. The noble family of Lang was prominent in the aristocracy of Thracian Primaris, and kept an ample summer palace in the east sector of Hive Primaris, near to the mercantile quarter where they had made their fortunes. The palace rose proud of the low Hab streets around it, swathed in its own force bubble. This had been one of the city areas we had supposed to be secure. With their power and resources, noble houses should have been able to protect themselves for the duration of the unrest. But not against a Saradon. He was inside, with all the resources of the palace to protect him. We met Heldane on the western approach road to the palace. He had a team of about 20 with him. The street itself was littered with bodies, most of them citizens. "He's controlling the crowds as if they were puppets," Heldane said curtly, with no word of greeting. "Waves of them keep coming at us, preventing us getting to the garden walls and the servants' annex along there." As I may have said, I had little time for Inquisitor Haldane. A very tall, grim man, his face an unsightly mass of scar tissue since an encounter with a hungry Carnodon back on Gudrun. He'd been Vok's pupil when I had first met him. Now he was a full Inquisitor with mental powers, it was said, that exceeded even his old masters. As I saw him there, I shuddered. He had undergone extensive surgery, not to disguise the damage to his face, but to exaggerate it. His skull seemed to have been extended into an almost equine shape, with a snout-like mouth full of blunt teeth and dark, murky eyes. Fiber wires and fluid tubes braided his cranium in place of hair. He wore plasteel body armor, the color of blood, and carried a segmented power glaive. "Eisenhorn?" he nodded, noticing me. It was like having a war horse shake its head in my direction. "They're coming again!" the cry went up from Haldane's men. Down the street, moving through the fire spills, figures were lurching towards us. "Weapons, stand ready," Haldane had spoken, but not with his voice. His psychic command shook through our skulls, and some of our own troopers looked dismayed. Missiles rained down on us, and the interior guardsmen raised an umbrella of riot shields. Small arms fired at us too, and an Arbites near me fell with his knee buckled the wrong way. Our attackers, some 100 or more, were hive citizens, blank-faced and moving like marionettes. As Haldane had reported, some monumental psychic force was making puppets out of them, the smoky night air ionized with a psionic backwash. I take no pleasure in actions like the one that followed. The beast Esaradon was forcing us to fight innocent civilians just to protect ourselves. Maybe he thought we'd shrink from the task and leave him alone. We, however, were the Inquisition. Curvel led his white consuls at the front, banging their weapons against their chest plates and howling defiance through their helmet speakers. I saw a Promethean bomb strike one and shatter, swathing him in liquid flame. He simply strode on. We fired over the mob's heads, trying to break them, but they had no will of their own. Our firing became kill shots. In 10 minutes, we had reluctantly added a fair number to the planet's rising death toll. That brought us to the corner of the street, facing the high walls of the garden and the edge of the palace's iridescent force shield itself. I could hear a low chuckling in my head. Esaradon. "Where's Lyco?" I heard Vok ask Haldane psychically.
"He took a team around the front to try and disable the force wall."
"You idiot!" I said out loud, looking over at Haldane. "This monster can control a crowd that big, and you mind speak this close to him?"
"This monster," Haldane replied, "can read every mind in the city and beyond. He knows what we're all doing. There is no point in secrecy, just effort. Is that beyond you?"
"How long until the next attack?" Curvel asked, reloading his weapon.
"They've become less frequent since we first arrived," replied Haldane. "However long it takes Esaradon to mind-search the surrounding habs and recruit another puppet force. He's having to cast his net wider each time."
"How did he get in there?" Roban asked. Haldane simply shook his head and shrugged. Roban, a robust inquisitor of middle years, dressed in brown and yellow layered robes, was a good man, though I didn't know him well. But he was an outspoken Xanthanite, and the ultra-Puritan Haldane had little time for him. Vok and Haldane fell to discussing possible assault plans with Curvel as the soldiers around us formed a defensive position. "This is a damn thankless task," Roban said to me. "I don't even know why we're here." "Cannon fodder," said his youthful interrogator, Inchabel, bluntly, and it made us both laugh. "There has to be something," I said. I took out my pocket scope and tried to read the energy patterns and spectrums. "You!" I called to one of the Arbites in our party, a grizzled precinct commander in full riot gear.
"Inquisitor?
"What's your name?"
Lucas, sir."
"Dear God, Emperor." I sighed again, and Roban laughed once more. "Okay, luckless. This palace must come into your precinct's patrol area.
"Yes, sir."
So street security around it is your responsibility."
"Again? Yes, sir."
"So, just as a matter of procedure, your section house will have on file the shield type and harmonics for the palace, in case of emergencies. In my experience, it was standard protocol for any Arbites precinct to know such things about key structures within their purview."
"It's classified, sir."
"Of course it is," I sighed again. "But now would be a good time." He got on his Vox link, and after a lot of effort, managed to get a channel open to the section house.
You're onto something, aren't you?
Robin asked me.
Maybe.
The wily Inquisitor Eisenhorn.
The what?
No offense, your reputation precedes you.
Does it now? In a good way? Robin grinned and shook his head, like a man who might have heard something, but who had decided to make up his own mind.
Yes. Without a live
It's an old Type
specimen,
10
I'm afraid
conical
the
void.
pinnacle of
Our
what
BT's
my
commander
son is able
Lucas
to
reported
accomplish.
presently.
Tangent 878 harmonic wave. We don't have an override code.
See, I've just
Lady Lang wouldn't permit it.
The alien's physiology
I bet
is
she wishes she had now,
her own.
said interrogator Inchabel, caustic and to the point once again. I was beginning to like him. Thank you, Luckless, I said.
It's Lucas, sir.
I know. I tried to remember everything Amos had counseled me about shields over the years. I wished I had his recall. Better still, I wished I had him here. We can collapse it, I said, with fair confidence.
Collapse
A void shield? Robin asked. It's conical, super surface only, and it's old. Voids shrug off just about anything, but they don't retain their field if you take out one or more of the projectors. That buttress there, the one the garden wall is built around, that's got to be one of the projector units, seated down into the ground. Robin nodded, apparently impressed. I see the logic, but not the practice. I walked over to Brother Sergeant Curvell, interrupting his conversation with Haldane without apology, and explained what I wanted to do. Haldane scoffed at once.
Lyco's already trying that.
How?
He's located the outer controls at the front gate and is trying to break their coding.
Coding and controls that will be dead and locked out thanks to a Saradon. Lyco's wasting his time. We can't switch this off. We can't break a Saradon's control over its system. But we can undermine the system itself. Haldane was about to speak again, but Voke shut him up.
I think Gregor may be onto something.
Why? Voke pointed. Close to 500 citizens were now advancing towards us from streets on all sides.
Because as you pointed out, Haldane, the monster can hear us, and he clearly doesn't like the sound of this plan.
It took Curvell about 10 minutes to gouge out the pavement and a section of garden wall with his lightning claw, and all the while we were under attack from the growing mob of puppets.
Sewer,
Curvell announced. I turned to the others as shots and missiles rained down. Commodus, you have to hold them off a while longer.
Count on it,
he said. Robin, get a small squad and follow me. Haldane wasn't happy. But by then, Haldane wasn't calling the shots anymore. I believe he took his rage out on the enslaved citizens. I dropped into the sewer hole with Curvell, Robin, Inchabel, and 3 troopers of the Interior Guard.
Commander,
The defense on the street above could barely spare any of them.
with your authorization,
The filthy
we
sewer
can begin
tube went in
researching
under the wall
answer
itself before
immediately.
dropping sharply away. Old patched stone swelled around the base of the buttress. The stone was warm, and foamy clumps of fungus were growing on it. Inchabel trained a spot beam in so I could see. Curvell could see in the dark. He took out his last 2 crack grenades and fixed them to the stonework with smears of adhesive paste from a tube he carried in his pack.
I wish we had more. We could blow the wall right through.
We could, Brother Sergeant, but this might be better.
Why?
Because if we can simply make this projector fail, the energies of the shield will short out before they collapse. Rather than blowing outwards, they'll cause an electromagnetic pulse within the field itself. And I think an EM pulse is the last thing a Saradon wants right now. As if to prove my suspicions right, a stabbing sheet of psychic power lashed at us. The Saradon had realized his vulnerability and was turning his immense power on us now. The puppets had been sport, but now it was time to control or blast out the minds of his hunters before they stopped being playthings and became a danger. The Psyker attack was devastating. 2 of the Interior Guardsmen simply died. Another started firing, hitting Curvell twice and wounding Inchabel. Regretfully, Robin blasted the trooper down with his las pistol. Our mines were harder to attack, especially given the shield formed by the rock above us and our proximity to the energy flux of the shield. But Robin, Inchabel, Curvell, and I would be dead or homicidal in seconds. How I wished for Elizabeth, or any of the distaff right then.
Trigger it! Trigger it!
I gasped, the blood vessels in my nose and throat opening yet again that day.
We're right on top of the...
Just do it, Brother Sergeant! In the name of the God Emperor! The blast took out the projector. It filled the sewer tunnel with flickering destruction. It would have killed us but for the fact that Brother Sergeant Cavell shielded us with his massive armored body. It cost him his life. I have made a point to have his name and memory celebrated by the White Consuls. With the generating projector killed, the void shield collapsed in on itself, blacking out the palace systems with the thunderclap of electromagnetic rage, blacking out a Saradon's seething mind, too. My research into untouchables, through Elizabeth and then through the distaff she created and ran, had indicated to me that perhaps psychic power, no matter how potent, relied in the final analysis on the electrical workings of the human mind, the firing of impulse charges between synapses. Untouchables somehow blanked this and triggered a disturbing and disarming vacancy in the natural and fundamental processes of the human brain. That, I had initially concluded, was why psychers don't work around untouchables, and why forgetfulness and unease is prevalent in their company. And ultimately why they disturb and upset humans so, and psychers doubly so. I turned the old void shield into a brief, bright, untouchable event. And now, Emperor damn him, the heretic psyker Saradon, temporarily rendered deaf, blind, and mute, was mine. Chapter 8. Saradon's Lair. Lyco the Victor. A Vestige. We went into the grounds of the Lang Palace over the wall. There was a harsh stink of ozone from the ruptured shield, and the trimmed fruit trees and lariboe hedges of the gardens were singed and smouldering. With Robin and Inchabel, I ran down a flint-chipped path between the servants' wing and the east portico. Flashlights and under-muzzle torches bobbed in the gardens behind us as Haldane led the main force of our troop round to the garden terrace. The house was dead and dark, all power killed by the pulse. The main doors on the east portico lay splintered on the mosaic floor, where the accompanying wave of overpressure from the void collapse had blown them in. All of the windows were smashed holes, too. Photoreceptors and climate controls in the portico's polished bluewood panels were fused and charred. Smoke and the glow of flames issued from deeper in the palace. We pushed further in, finding dead house staff and inert servitors. A whole suite of staterooms on the first floor was burning, where ornate promethium lamps had been knocked over. We checked the rooms on each side as we progressed. Robin led the way, sweeping his braced las pistol from side to side. "How long?" Inchabel asked me. "Until?" "Until he recovers from the pulse." I didn't know. There was no telling how badly we'd hurt Saradon, or how resilient his mind was. We hadn't got long. On the second floor, a flight of etherite steps brought us up into a grand banqueting hall. The roof, a turtleback of toughened glass, had fallen in, and the psi storms crackled and surged in the sky far above. Every step crunched glass or disturbed debris. There were bodies here, too, the bodies of nobility and servants intermingled. I heard movement and sobbing from an adjoining antechamber. The wretched occupants of the room gasped in terror as our flashlights found them. A handful of survivors from the household, cowering in fear in the dark. Many displayed signs of psychic burns or telekinetic welts. "Imperial Inquisition," I said firmly but quietly. "Stay calm. Where is Saradon?" Some flinched or moaned at the sound of the name. A regal dowager in a torn pearlescent gown curled up in the corner and began weeping. "Quickly! There's little time. Where is he?" I thought to use my will to spur them into an answer, but their minds had been tortured enough already that night. Even a mild mental probe might kill some of them. "When the lights went out, he ran towards the west exit," said a blood-soaked man, dressed in what I presumed was the uniform of the House Lang bodyguard. "Can you show us?" "My leg's broken." "Someone else, then. Please." "Fleur, you go. Fleur." The bodyguard gestured to a terrified page boy crouching behind a column. "Come on, lad. Show us the way," Robin said encouragingly. The boy got to his feet, his eyes white with fear. I wasn't sure if he was more afraid of Saradon or the Inquisitors looming over him. A communicating hallway ran from the rear of the banqueting hall west, towards the house's private landing platform. Specks of blood and glass twinkled along its tiled floor. I felt what seemed to me a breath of wind on my skin. An exit to the outside, perhaps. Heavy blast shutters were prized open in the entrance to the gloomy loading dock. Past the shadowy shapes of several slumped, dormant cargo servitors stood a main hatchway through which cold exterior light flickered. My weapon raised, I waved Robin and Inchabel round to the right. The page boy cowered back in the doorway. The air quality was changing, as if the atmosphere itself was stiffening and drawing tight, like some great force gathering its breath. Esaradon was recovering, I was certain. Livid green light suddenly bathed the loading dock, a psychometric flare accompanying a burst of savage psionic power. Robin and I staggered, our lungs squeezed and fingers of telekinesis thrusting at our minds. Inchabel cried out as he was bowled over from behind by the page boy, Frua. Dull-eyed and frothing at the mouth, the boy had been reduced in an instant to a mindless puppet. Inchabel fought, but the boy was feral, and despite the interrogator's superior bulk, he was pinned. The pain in my head was intense, but I knew Esaradon must still be way below full strength. I raised the strongest mind shield my abilities were able to conjure, and moved forward. There was a sudden grind of servo gears. A large steel paw swung at my head, and I dived back. A cargo servitor, its metal carapace caked with verdigris, rose up to its full height of 3 meters and clanked across the deck towards me on squat hydraulic legs. Plumes of steam squirted from its broad shoulder joints as it pistoned its arms at me again. Hot yellow dots of light burned in the eye sockets of its dented visor. Despite its mechanical appearance, the cargo drone, like all servitors, was built around human organic components. Brain, brainstem, neural network, glands, so Esaradon could control it just like a standard human. It swung at me again, and missed. The slicing limb had cut the air with a distinct whistle. It was built like a great simian, squat legs, barrel chest, wide shoulders and long, thick arms. Ideal for hefting heavy cargo items into the belly hold of a lift ship. Ideal for smashing a human body into gory paste. Robin cried out a warning. A second, larger cargo servitor with a long quadruped body was also moving. Its body casing was pitted brown metal, and it had a forklifter assembly where its head should have been, giving it the appearance of a bull. The greased black forks of the lifter lurched at Robin, who fired 6 or 7 shots that dented or bounced off the machine's chassis. I ducked 2 more slow, heavy blows from the ape servitor. We were losing precious time. With every tick of the clock, Esaradon was recovering and becoming more powerful. I put a bolt round into the thickest part of the servitor's body and rocked it back, the gears and pistons of its legs whining as they compensated for the recoil. My power sword was out now, the blade burning. Blessed for me by the Provost of Inks, it was my weapon of choice. My swordsmanship had always been good, but Arianod had instructed me in the Carthaean Ul Waila Skraii before her death. Ul Waila Skraii, literally, the genius of sharpness, the Carthaean way of the sword. I made a figure-of-8 turn, the gun fassel, and then a backhand crosscut, the huin, or reverse form of the Tarn Weiler. The stroke was good. The energized blade sliced clean through the servitor's left forearm, sending the massive manipulator paw clattering to the deck. It lurched bodily at me, as if enraged, clawing with its remaining hand and lashing with the fused, smoking end of its recently truncated limb. I made a head-height horizontal parry called the Uisar, and then left and right block strokes, the Ulsar and the Win Ulsar. Sheets of sparks cascaded from each hit against its metal body. I ducked right under the next huge blow, spun round out of the crouch, and came up to face it again, in time to follow through with the Ura Waili Bai, the devastating diagonal downslash, left to right. My blade edge and tip sawed the servitor's torso plating wide open in an electrical flash. The exchange had given me long enough to mentally identify the seat of the servitor's brainstem component, lit up and glowing in my mind's eye with the psionic power that drove it. It lay deep under the carapace between the collarbones. One more Uisar, and then the Ulkar, the deathstroke. Tip first, plunging clean through the bodywork, impaling the organic brain. I rested the crackling blade there for a moment while the yellow dot eyes went out, and then ripped it clear again, sidestepping as the servitor slammed down onto the flooring. "Robin!" I called out, leaping over my dispatched foe. but Roman was dead. The servitor's forks had his limp body impaled through the belly, and it was shaking it as if trying to dislodge him. Inchabel was on his feet, tears streaming down his face as he blasted at the servitor with his autogun. Cursing, I ran forward, raised the power sword with both hands, and swung it down over the servitor's back. I doubt the Carthaeans, in all their wisdom, have a name in the most hallowed Ilwaya for an enraged downstroke that severs the backbone and torso of a servitor. Inchabel ran to his dead master as the servitor collapsed, trying to pull the corpse clear. Later for that, I said, spiking the command with my will. Inchabel was close to losing his wits to anger and grief, and I needed him. He snatched up his weapon and ran after me. "The page boy?" I asked. "I had to hit him. I hope he's just unconscious." We came out into the storm-racked night on the palace landing pad. Psychic lightning splintered the sky above us, and the wind lashed us. There was no one on the pad itself, but a fight was raging on the lawns beyond. I could see 8 figures, some robed, some dressed in the body armor of the interior guard, closing to surround a lone humanoid who crackled and glowed with spectral light. Thorny jags of flame lit out from the cornered figure and dropped one of the guardsmen as we watched. Esaradon. They had Esaradon cornered. Inchabel and I leapt down from the pad, a 3-meter drop onto the wet grass, and ran to join the fray. I could see Esaradon clearly now, despite the rain. A tall, almost naked man with wild black hair and a lean, stringy body, corpuscent, gleaming and sliding around his capering limbs. We were just 10 meters from the edge of the fight when one of the robed figures raised a bulky weapon and blasted at the rogue psyker. A plasma gun. The violet beam, almost too bright to look at, struck Esaradon. In his weakened state, he had no defense against it. He ignited like an incendiary round and burned from head to foot in the middle of the lawn. Lowering our weapons, Inchabel and I walked to join the ring of figures standing around the white-hot pyre. As his robed and hooded acolytes murmured prayers of grace and deliverance, Inquisitor Lyco set down his plasma gun. "The Emperor will thank you, Lyco," I said. He glanced round, seeing me for the first time. "Eisenhorn?" He nodded. His narrow face was lined and taut, and his blue eyes hooded. He was only about 50 years old, sidereal, a mere youth by Inquisitional standards. Young enough for his promising career to survive the way this day's atrocity would tarnish his achievement on Dulcine. "I do not serve the Emperor for his gratitude. I do it for the glory of the Imperium." "Quite so," I said. I looked back at the molten heat that had been our quarry. It mattered little to me that I'd made this opportunity for Lyco. He could take the glory. I didn't care. The escape of the Psychers had stolen much of the glory he had received of late. Hunting them down was the only way he could make amends. Planet-wide, there was some sense of rejoicing when it was announced that Lord Commander Helican had survived the carnage unscathed, and that War Master Honorius would live. That announcement came on the 6th day of unrest, by which time the Imperial authorities had begun to reimpose order on the stricken citizens of Thracian Primaris. But it helped. Common folk who assumed themselves to be lost were calmed into believing law was back in the hands of the great and good. Panics died away. Arbite's units unleashed their last few suppression raids against the die-hard recidivist looters in the Lohabs. My own spirits were not much lifted. For a start, I was privy to the confidential fact that Lord Commander Helican had actually died, screaming and shitting himself under a crash-diving Imperial Navy Lightning on the avenue of the Victor Bellum. A double had been arranged by the Ecclesiarchy and the Helican Senatorum, and that double continued to act in his place until, several years later, he died naturally of old age, and a successor was established in less turbulent circumstances. I can speak of that public deceit now in this private record, but at the time, communicating that secret was a death crime for even the highest lord of the Imperium. I was not about to break that confidence. I am an Inquisitor, and I understand how fundamental it is to maintain public order. In addition to fatigue and the pain of my wounds, what darkened my mood was the news about Gideon Ravenel. Now, of course, we all understand what a priceless and brilliant contribution he was to make to Imperial learning, and how that would never have happened if he had not been confined to a life of mental rumination. But back then, in that stinking hospice ward off the Street of Prescience, All I saw was a young man, burned and crippled and physically paralyzed, a brilliant inquisitor ruined before he could fulfill his potential. Ravener, in the eyes of some, had been lucky. He had not been amongst the 198 Inquisition personnel killed outright by the crashing fighter that fell into the Great Triumph beyond the Spatian Gate. He, like 50 others, had been caught on the edge of the explosion and lived. My pupil was barely recognizable, a blood-wet bundle of charred flesh, 100% burns. Blind, deaf, mute, his face so melted that an incision had been made in the fused meat where his mouth should have been, so he could breathe. The loss touched me acutely, the waste even more. Gideon Ravener had been the greatest, most promising pupil I had ever taught. I stood by his plastic-sheeted cot, listening to the suck and drool of his ventilator and fluid drains, and remembered what Commodus Voke had said in the RBT sector house on Blamacide Street.
I will make amends. I will not rest until every one of these wretches is destroyed and order restored. And then I will not rest until I find who and what was behind it.
Right then, there, for Ravener's sake, I made that promise to myself, too. At that time, I had little idea what that would mean or where it would take me. I returned to the Ocean House at last on what would have been the 9th and final day of the Holy Novena. There was no one to greet me, and the place seemed empty and forlorn. I stalked into my study, poured a too large measure of vintage Amasek, and flopped down into an armchair. It felt like an eternity since I had sat here with Titus Endor, worrying over speculations that seemed now so insignificant and remote. A door opened. From the instant chill in the air, I knew at once it was Bequin.
We didn't know you'd returned, Gregor.
Well, I have, Elizabeth.
So I see.
Are you all right? I shrugged. Where is everybody? She paused, considering her words.
When the tragedy occurred, there was a great public commotion. Yarat and Kirscher took the staff into the secure bunkers for safety, and I locked myself away with the distaff in the West Wing, waiting, hoping for your call.
Channels were out.
Yes, for 8 days.
But everyone is safe?
Yes.
I leaned out of my chair and looked at her. Her face was pale and drawn from too many nights of fear. Where's Amos?
Outside, with Betancourt, Kirscher and Nail. Von Beeg's around too. Is it true what we've heard about Gideon?
Elizabeth, it's... She crouched down and put her arms around me. It is difficult for a psyker to be hugged by an untouchable, no matter how long and close their personal history. But her intentions were good, and I tolerated the contact for as long as it seemed polite. When I gently pushed her back, I said, "Send them in. In fact, send everyone in here."
They won't all fit, Gregor.
The sea terrace, then. One last time. Sitting or standing around in the lime glow of the sea terrace, the numerous members of my faithful band looked at me expectantly. The place was packed. Yarat had fussed around, bringing out drinks and sweetmeats until I'd pressed a glass of Amasek into her gnarled hands and forced her down into a chair. "I'm closing the Ocean House," I said. There was a murmur. "I'm retaining the lease, but I have little wish to live here anymore. In fact, I have little wish to be on Thracian anymore. Not after this holy novena. There seems no point maintaining a staff here."
"But, sir, the library..."
Sullus said from the back. I held up a finger. "I will take up a contract arrangement with one of the Hive Accommodation Bureau to keep the house in working order with servitors. Who knows? Sometime I might have need of a place here again." I refilled my glass before turning back. "But I wish to move my center of operations. It's compromised, if nothing else." At that, Eubel Kirscher looked into his sit juice uncomfortably. "I wish to relocate the household to the estate on Gudrun. Its environment suits me better than this hive hell. Yarat, you and Kirscher will supervise the packing and organization for the move. I would like you to undertake the duties of head of household at the Gudrun estate, if you are willing. I realize you have never been off Thracian." She sat forward, her eyebrows raised, considering this sudden change to her life. I would be honored to do so, sir," she said. "I'm pleased. The country air will do you good. The estate is managed by a caretaker staff, so I'll need a good housekeeper and a good chief of house security. Jubal, I'd like you to consider that job.
Thank you, sir, said Kirscher.
Solus, we're going to transplant the library permanently to Gudrun. That task is yours, as is the ongoing duty of being my librarian. Can I entrust you with it?
Oh, yes. There will be problems, of course. The handling and care of certain shielded texts and...
But can I leave it with you? Solus waved his frail hands at me in a gesture of excitement that made everyone laugh. I know this wholesale move will take months to manage and carry out. Alain, I'd like you to supervise and oversee the whole thing. Von Beeg looked suddenly awkward.
Of course, Inquisitor.
This is a weighty task, Interrogator. Are you up to it?
Yes, sir.
Good. I will return to the Gudrun estate no later than 10 months from now. I trust it will be the home I expect. It was a promise I would fail miserably to keep.
What of the distaff, sir?
Asked Sir Scover. I want to divide that, I said. I want 6 of the best distaff members sent to Gudrun to bide there at my wishes. The future of the distaff itself I see as separate from my living arrangements. I have a lease on a spire-top residence on Messina. That will be the new official home of the distaff. Sir Scover, you will supervise the move and establishment of the untouchable school there. She nodded, shocked. Bequin seemed taken aback. I looked round at the 100-plus servants, warriors, and aides crammed into the room. That's it. Until I see you all again. May the God Emperor protect you. I was left alone with Amos, Bequin, Medea, and Nail. Not for us the chores of moving house, I said.
I had a hunch not,
smirked Medea. For us, 2 missions.
For us?
Asked Bequin. Yes, Elizabeth. Unless you think you and I are too old for such diversions.
No,
I've been too long at the back of things. Too long relying on my capable staff. I yearn for field work.
The last field work we were in nearly got you killed, scolded Bequin darkly.
Proving that I'm losing my edge, I think. For shame, muttered Nail with a smile. So, we're going to have an adventure, all of us. Just the few of us. Remember what those were like, Amos?
Frankly, I'm still not over them, Gregor. But yes.
Elizabeth? Bequin crossed her arms ill-humouredly. Oh, I'd just love to come and watch you get killed. We're all agreed, then, I said. I can't help being deadpan. Gorgon Locke made sure of that. But my delivery was good enough to get Nail and Medea raucous with laughter, and Amos chuckling. Elizabeth Bequin grinned, despite herself. 2 missions, as I said. After this briefing, I'll allow you to recruit a few personnel from the staff. Nail, a fighter or 2 you can count on. Amos, an astropath we can use without worry. Elizabeth, 1 or 2 from the distaff. A maximum of 10 in the party, all told. No more, you understand? Argue it out between yourselves. Don't bring me into it. We leave in 2 days, and I don't want to even hear about any arguments second-hand.
So what are the missions?
Asked Medea, lounging back in her padded chair and slipping her long legs over the arm. She took a long swig of her weed wine and added,
You said 2, right?
2. I pushed a stud on a data wand in my hand, and a hololithic screen fogged into life over the table. The words of the message I'd received before the start of the tumult and Thracian were displayed in shimmering letters. Scalpel cuts quickly. Eager tongues revealed. At Cadia, by terse. Hound wishes thorn. Thorn should be sharp. Shit, cried Nail.
Is that authentic?
Medea asked, looking at me. It is.
God Emperor, he's in trouble. He needs us,
Bequin murmured. Very probably. Medea, you have to arrange transit for us to Cadia. That's the first port of call.
What's the second?
Asked Amos. The second?
The second mission.
I looked at them all. We all know how serious the Cadian matter is. But I made a vow to Gideon. I want to find out what was behind the outrage here. I want to find it, hunt it out, and punish it. You know, it's funny how things turn out. It was late, and we were devouring a splendid meal Yarat had prepared for us. Nail was telling a devastatingly crude joke to Amos and Medea, and Bequin and I were talking over the rearrangement of the distaff and the missions ahead. I think she was feeling excited. Like me, she'd been taking a back seat for too long. Kirscher came up the terrace, entering the filmy green light. "Sir, you have a visitor." "At this hour? Who?" "He says his name is Inchabel, sir. Interrogator Nathan Inchabel." Inchabel was waiting for me in the library. "Interrogator, has my staff offered you refreshment?" "None needed, sir." "Very well. So to what do I owe this visit?" Inchabel, no more than 25, pushed his thick blonde hair out of his eyes and looked at me fiercely. I am masterless. Robin is dead." "God Emperor rest him. He will be missed." "Sir, do you ever think what it would be like if you died?" The notion stopped me in my tracks. I had, in all honesty, never considered it. "No, Inchabel, I haven't." "It's a terrible thing, sir. As Robin's senior acolyte, it falls to me to disperse his staff, his fortune, his knowledge. I'm left to tidy up, as it were. I have to make sense of Robin's estate." "You will not fail in that duty, Interrogator. Of that I'm sure." He smiled weakly. "Thank you, sir. I had thought to come to you and beg you to take me on. I so very much want to be an Inquisitor. My master is dead, and I know that your own Interrogator is..." "Indeed, I choose my own staff, of course. Inquisitor Eisenhorn, begging you to take me on as a driftwood student was not why I came here. As I said, I had to close up Robin's estate. That meant filing and authorizing the pathologica statement of his death. Inquisitor Robin was killed by a cargo servitor manipulated by a rogue psyker." "Yes?" "So to complete the papers, I had to review the death notice of Asaradon so as to establish causal motive." "That is the procedure," I admitted. "The statement was very brief. Asaradon's corpse was burnt from the calves upwards and utterly immolated. As in the incidents of spontaneous human combustion, the relics left by the plasma weapon were little more than the flesh and bones of the feet and ankles. Just bare vestiges. And? There was no Malleus brand on the ankle flesh. What? I don't know who Inquisitor Lyko burned on the lawns of the Langhouse, but it wasn't the heretic Isaradon." Chapter 9. Ichan, 6 weeks later. A word with the Fant. Knives in the night. The bicephalic minder in the squalid doorway of the twist bar regarded us with one of his lice-ridden heads, while the other glazed out, smoking an obscura pipe.
Know your place. Not your kind. Get on.
The sap rain was falling heavily on our heads through the rotten awning, and I had little wish to stand in it any longer. I nodded a sidelong glance to my companion, who tugged back his hood and showed the minder the cluster of malformed, winking eyes that mottled his cheek and ran down his pallid throat. I raised my own damp cloak and revealed the knot of stunted tentacles that sprouted from an extra sleeve slit under my right armpit. The minder got off his stool, one head nodding dozily. He was big, broad, and tall as an ogrin, and his greasy skin was busy with tattoos. He muttered, limping around us as he sized us up.
Maybe then. You didn't smell like twists. Okay.
We went inside, down a few dark steps into a nocturnal clubroom that was fogged with obscura smoke and pulsing with a brand of harsh, discordant music called Pound. Panes of red glass had been put over the lights of the lanterns, and the place was a hellish swamp, like the damnation paintings of that insane genius Orma Metia. Malforms, deforms, half-breeds, and underscum huddled or gambled or drank or danced. On a raised stage, a naked, heavy-breasted, eyeless girl with a grinning mouth where her navel should have been, gyrated to the pound beat. We reached the bar, a soiled curve of hardwood under a series of hard white lights. The barkeep was a bloated thing with bloodshot eyes and a black snake tongue that flickered between his wet, slit mouth and rotting teeth.
Hey, Twist, what will it be?
2 of those, I said, pointing to clear grain alcohol shots that a waitress was carrying past on a tray. She would have been beautiful, except for the yellow quills stippling her skin. Twists. We were all twists here. Mutant is a dirty word if you're a mutant. They delight in referring to themselves by the Imperium's glibbest and most detrimental slang, as a badge of honor. It's a pride thing, a common habit with any underclass. Non-telepaths do it when they call themselves blunts. The tall, slender people of low-grav Sylvan do it when they call themselves sticks. A slur's not a slur if you use it on yourself. Labour laws on Ichan permit Twists to work as indentured labourers in the industrial mill farms and the sap distilleries, provided they abide by the local regime and keep themselves to the licensed shantytowns huddled in the skirts of the bad end of Ichan main hive. The barkeep slapped 2 heavy shot glasses down on the counter and filled them to the brim with grain liquor from a spouted flask. I tossed a couple of coins down and reached for my drink. The bloodshot eyes leered at me.
What's this? Imperial coins? Come now, Twist. You know we ain't allowed to trade in those.
I paused. A glance down the counter showed me that the rest of the clientele were paying in mill-authorized coupons or nuggets of base metal, and that they were all staring and scowling at us. A basic mistake, right off the bat. My companion leaned forward and sipped his drink.
Don't get fret with 2 thirsty Twists who's happened to have lucked into a good black score, eh?
The barkeep smiled and his black tongue flickered. He scooped up the coins.
Ain't no fret, Twist. You earn 'em, I'll take 'em. Just saying you might not want to go flashing 'em's all.
We took our drinks away from the bar, looking for a table. It had taken 6 weeks to reach Ichan, and I was impatient for a lead. The beat changed. Another pound number began pumping through the underfloor speakers, which to my untutored ears was simply a variation in auditory assault. But the crowd clapped and roared approval. The naked girl with the grinning stomach began rotating her hips the other way. I have a feeling I should be leaving this to you, I whispered to my companion.
You're doing fine.
Don't get fret, Twist. For God Emperor's sake, where did you learn to talk like that?
You never hung with Twists?
Not like this.
So I'm guessing you don't shlove that Jean Jack Pound beat, Twist.
Stop it or I'll shoot you. Harlan Nail grinned and blinked with all his 16 eyes in mock offense.
Sup up, Twist. If that ain't fantastic, I'll poke my eyes out.
Oh, let me, I hissed and slugged back my shot.
Raise 'em and sink 'em, and let's have another.
I grimaced to myself as the burning spirit scalded down my esophagus, and then scooped 2 more drinks from the tray of the porcupine girl as she sashayed past. Fant Mastic sat with his cronies in a side booth. Generations of Radstorm mutation had made him an obese thing with wrinkled flesh and enlarged features. His ears were frayed fan-like swathes of veiny skin, and his nose was a drooping proboscis. An incongruous tuft of thick red hair decorated his Neanderthal brow. His eyes were deep-set and black. And sad, I thought. Tremendously sad. He was drinking from a big tankard by snorting the alcohol up through his dangling nose. His mouth, distorted by tusk-like jags of tooth, was useless. A Twist whore, with an unnecessary number of arms, was sipping her drink, smoking an Obscura stick, retouching her makeup and doing something to Fant under the table that he was clearly enjoying. We approached. Fant's minders got up immediately to block us. A horned brute and a Twist whose entire head was a wrinkled skin hood for an outsized eye. They both reached into their robes.
How are you tonight, Twists?
Puffed Horn Brute.
We fine, no fret. Just gonna talk to the Fant,
said Nail. Ain't not gonna happen, said Big Eye, his voice muffled by his clothing. God Emperor knew where his mouth was.
I think so. When we have such a scalding black score, him to enjoy.
Nail didn't shrink back.
Let them through,
Fant said, his voice conveyed by an augmetic carry-sound unit, a Vox implant. Few Twists had the money for that. Fant was certainly a player. The minders stepped aside and allowed us into the booth. We sat.
Go on. Twist, I tell you, we be in the market for Section Alpha brain jobs. We's hear you got one for the begging. Yeah. Where?
Round and around, said Nail.
Aha. And you are?
Just 2 Twists gonna earn us a deal, I said.
That right.
We sat in silence for a moment as Fant called for more drinks. The girl was now combing and fixing her hair and doing her makeup. One of her many hands was on my knee under the table. She winked at me, with an eye growing from the end of her tongue.
What I got ain't no Section Alpha, Twists. It's a Section Alpha Plus. That's why we came to you, Fant. That's why. No upper limit for our buy. How you gonna pay?
Nail dropped one of the ingots onto the table.
Pure mellow yellow. And we got the bars. Much as it takes. So, Sven, where? I gotta talk to some people. Okay. Where can I reach you? The twist and sleep. You sleep tight. Maybe I call you.
The audience was over. We took a table of our own near the raised stage and stayed for a couple more rounds, making a show of appreciating the indecent writhings of the girl with the belly mouth. After an hour or so, we saw Fant and his retinue leave by a side door. "Let's go," I said. We finished our drinks and rose. Nail gave Porcupine Girl a handful of coins and patted her bottom. Her quills bristled, but she smiled. The Minder didn't spare us a look with either of his heads as we left. Out of sight, round the corner of the dreary bar stoop, I handed Nail one of a pair of brass stim injectors, and we detoxed quickly to rid our bodies of the alcohol dulling our systems. It was the dead of night, but there was little darkness. The great curve of Ichan's ring systems glowed with reflecting sunlight and shone like bands of diamond-crusted platinum. The main street of the shanty was a rutted, waterlogged morass, and flaking boardwalk pavements edged the rows of slumping, dingy buildings. Glowing signs and the few street lamps reflected in the street puddles. Beyond the shanty, to the west, the alpine slopes of the main hive rose against the stars, like a dark mountain of trash decorated with 1,000,000 little lights. To the east were the stacked grubby mushrooms of the mill farms and the distilleries, venting brown steam and yellow pollutants into the wind. To the south, in the verdant farmlands, plains of thick rubbery growth, we could see the running lights of several vast harvesters. They were segmented juggernauts, beetle-like machines the size of small starships, chewing up the greenbelt with massive reaping mandibles and digesting it through vast interior vats and work lines. Flues lined their backs like spines and spewed moisture waste and atomized sap up high into the atmosphere, where it drifted and fell again like rain. Everything in the twist shanty was sticky with sapfall. The rain was tacky and thick like syrup. The street puddles were viscous. Downpipes glugged and throbbed rather than pouring. Everywhere there was a stench of decomposing plant fibre and liquefied cellulose. "Do you think he took the bait?" I asked. Nail nodded.
You could see he was interested. Gold's rare on Ichan. His eyes lit when I showed him that ingot.
"He'll want to check us, though."
Of course, he's a businessman.
We walked along the street, hoods raised against the sticky rain. There were a few mutants around, all of them dressed in rancid tatters. They shambled along, lurked in doorways around covered braziers, or shared obscura bottle pipes out of the rain and dim breezeways. A squirt of sirens warbled down the main street, and Nail pulled me into an alley end. A black armoured landspeeder with blazing grilled lamps crept past. I saw the crest motif of the main hive RBTs on the side, and an armoured officer sat in the top hatch manipulating a spotlight. The beam played across us and passed along. Another flute of siren noise sounded, and we heard a vox-amplified voice demand,
"Idents and papers, you five, now!"
Moaning and grumbling, a pack of twists moved out into the street, lit by the spot beam, as the officers dismounted to shake them down and run their gene prints through the system. Something we couldn't afford to let happen. Not if we wanted to maintain our position as anonymous mutants. One flash of my credentials would speed us past any RBT's red tape, but it might also alert Lyco. I'd insisted on full concealment for the mission. No one knew we were here officially. Amos had done some surreptitious checking, and there was no official trace of Lyco either. But that was to be expected, and there was no telling how many main hive officials he might have backhanded to alert him of any inquisitorial presence. Nail and I turned west at the next junction, and followed the maze of alleys and breezeways between the rents and millhabs to reach the twist and sleep by a circuitous route that would keep us off the main thoroughfares and away from our BT's patrols. And, as it turned out, bring us right into trouble. It didn't look like trouble at first. A short, flat-browed runt in rags stepped into our path, grinning like a salesman. He held his hands open as if he was going to curtsy.
Twists, my friends. Spare a few perials for a poor bad gene down on his luck."
I heard Nail begin to say,
"Not tonight, Twist. Let's get you to one side."
but I had already tensed. How had this scab scum known to ask for imperial coins if he hadn't seen us at the bar and followed us on purpose? His accomplices came out of the gloom and sap rain behind us. I rammed the word evade hard into Nail's mind with a pathic surge and dropped. A massive spiked weapon sailed through the space our heads had just been occupying and connected with nothing but air. The runt who had waylaid us uttered quite the most obscene series of curses I'd ever heard and dived on me. He had a double-headed dagger with a knurled handguard. I caught his upflung wrist as he made to gouge at me, broke his elbow, and kicked him through a nearby fence while he was still screaming in pain. "Boss, move!" I heard Nail sing out, and I rolled hard aside in the mud as the spiked weapon slammed down into the mire. It was a thick length of timber with dozens of nails and knife blades hammered through it. The friendly end of it was held by two amazingly large paws. The paws belonged to a hulk, a 200-kilo monster covered with blistered fish scales and bony scutes. It wore only a pair of ragged blue trousers, held in place around its midriff, almost comically, by a pair of red braces. It swung the spike post at me again, and I had to dive and shoulder roll to escape it. Nail was going toe-to-toe with two others, a snouted female in black leather whose mouth and nose were hideously combined into one drooling, snarling organ, and a tall, thin male with a face peculiarly distorted by bone and gristle. The female had a reaping sickle in each hand, and the tall male was armed with a mace made out of a reinforced strut, toothed with the rusting blades of two wood saws. Nail had drawn his serrated short sword and dueling knife, and was fending off thrusts and strikes from both of them. A power sword, a bolt gun, a las carbine. They would all have finished this unnecessary encounter fast enough, but we had agreed to carry nothing that would mark us out from the twist population. Tech levels were low in the shanty. A plasma gun might have ended this quickly, but stories would have got round. The scaly giant was on me again, and I fell through the rotting flakboard of a fence in my efforts to evade his swing. I found myself lying amid the debris in the backyard of one of the loathsome habrents. A light went on in an upper window, and abuse, stones, and the contents of a chamber pot were hurled at me. The giant came on, swinging his club from side to side. The nails and blades were darkly caked with dried blood. He backed me towards the rear of the rent dwelling and made to swing again. "No!" I commanded, using the will. He stopped dead. The rain of abuse and excrement from above stopped too. It would take him a moment to reconfigure his mind and find his anger again. I moved right at him, punching a knuckle-curved fist at the place where his nose should have been. There was a crack of bone and a spray of blood. The giant went down hard on his back. His nasal bone slammed back into his brain. Nail seemed to be enjoying his uneven duel. He was jeering at his attackers, deflecting the sickles with his sword and blocking the strenuous attacks of the mace with his knife. I saw him spin and belly-kick the male away, then turn to give the ghastly, snorting female his full attention. But more figures were emerging from the night. Ugly, ab-human scum dressed in rags. 3, 4 of them. I called a warning out to Nail and pulled out my black powder pistol. It was a clumsy antique I'd acquired from the black market on Front's planet, but even so I dumbed it down to Echan tech levels by replacing the engraved furniture with a shaped piece of packet wood. The flintlock mechanism was in good order, though. It cracked loudly with a fizz and a flash, the recoil punishing my wrist, and the ball went point-blank through the forehead of the nearest twist, exploding the rear of his cranium in a surprisingly messy fountain. But it was a one-shot piece, and there was no time for reloading. 2 of the remaining outlaws came right at me, the other turning to come in on Nail's flank. I broke the teeth of the first one to reach me with the rounded butt of the pistol, and ducked the second's poorly judged slice with a rapier. Backing away, I drew my own blade, also a rapier, shorter by a good 10 centimetres than my opponent's, but balanced and guarded with a hand net of articulated metal struts. Our blades clashed. He was good, trained to his skill by a life of slaughter in the underhive, but I had me on my side. I dazzled him with the Ulsar and the Uin Ulsar, and then drove him back with a 4-stroke combination of Pel Igam and Uin Pel Inar, before ripping the blade out of his dazed fingers with a swift Tan Asaf Wailar. Then the Ul Ker. My blade transfixed his torso. He looked confused for a second, and then fell down, sliding dead off my blade. His broken-faced accomplice, blood spilling from my pistol-whipping, flew at me, and I span, decapitating him with the edge of my blade. The Carthaginians believe side-blade work is lazy and stress the use of the point. But what the hell? Nail had killed the third attacker with a body punch, and as I turned, he locked both of the female's sickles around his twisting knife and ran her through with his main blade. He turned to me and raised his bloody short sword to his nose in a salute. I returned it with my rapier. The siren of an Arbites ground car was wailing along the alley. "Time to be gone," I said to Nail. "I thought you were dead," Beckwin cursed, as Nail and I burst into the room in the twist and sleep. "We had some fun on the way home," Nail said. "Don't worry, Lizzie. I brought the boss back safe." I smiled and fixed myself a small amasec from the bureau. Beckwin hated to be called Lizzie. Only Nail had the balls to do it. Amos was hovering by the window. Somehow the rags of his twist disguise suited him.
"Most perturbatory. The Arbites are coming this way."
"What?" Nail moved to the window.
Amos is right. 3 land cruisers pulled up outside. Officers coming in.
"Hide yourselves, now," I ordered. Amos hurried through the communicating door into the other bedchamber and threw himself down on the cot. Nail blundered into the adjoining bathroom and used a tooth mug and loud groans to suggest he was busy throwing up. Elizabeth looked at me frantically. "Into bed, hurry," I ordered. The Arbites kicked open the door and played their flashlights over the bed.
"Hive Arbites! Who's in here?"
"What is this?" I asked, dragging the sheets back.
"Street fight killers. Witnesses say they came in here," said the Arbite sergeant, advancing towards the bed.
"Me? I've been here all night. Me and my friends."
"They gonna vouch for you, Twist?"
asked the sergeant, raising his weapon.
"What's going on? Too much light,"
said Beckwin, emerging from the dirty linen on the bed. Somehow she had removed her dress beneath the sheets. Clad in brief underwear, she slithered on top of me.
"What's you doing? Stopping a girl making her way? Shame on you."
The sergeant ran his flashlight beam up and down the length of her body as it clung to me. I smiled the insane smile of the lucky or well-oiled. He snapped the light off.
"Sorry to interrupt you, miss."
The door closed, and the Arbites thumped away. I looked down at Beckwin with a wink. "Good improvisation," I said. She leapt off me and grabbed her clothes. "Don't get any funny ideas, Gregor." I'd had funny ideas about her for years, truth be told. She was beautiful and sublimely sexy. But she was also an untouchable. It hurt me to be close to her, physically hurt. I hate that fact. I feel a lot for Beckwin, and I long to be with her, but it was never going to happen. Never, ever. That's one of the truly great sadnesses of my life. And hers too, I hope, in my more self-aggrandizing moments. I lay in bed and watched her drag on her dress again, and I felt the pang of desire. But there was no way. No way in the galaxy. She was untouchable. I was a psyker. That way pain and madness lay. Chapter 10. Ruminations on Lyco. The Chew After. The Highest Bidder. Tumultuous sap storms hammered the twist town in the pre-dawn, blanketing the sky with swirling vapors and shaking the tiles and shutters with the gross weight of their heavy, pelting goop. Thunder rolled. In the aftermath, veils of mist swathed the countryside, and the stillness was alive with gurgling and dripping and the swarming scurry of sap lice and storm bugs. Nail went out early with Amos and bought paper pails of warm food from the Twist Town commissary just down the street, which was already serving the work lines forming for the shift change in the mills. By the time they returned, we had been joined by Inshabel and Husman, who had slept through the night's altercation with the Arbites in a shared room down the hall. I'd yet to formally notify the Ordo that Inshabel had joined my band, but he was now very much part of it. I felt he had the right to be here on this mission, for Robin's sake, and for his own. He had brought the news of Asaradon to me, directly and selflessly. Few of my team yet referred to him by his rank. It would be a long time until anyone eclipsed the memory of Interrogator Ravenel, but he had meshed well with his bright mind and healthy, caustic wit. He was already providing me with more solid service than Alain von Beg had ever managed. Duj Husman had been a skin hunter on his homeworld of Windhover when Harlan Nail had first met him. That was back in Nail's bounty-chasing days, before he'd joined my cause. I'd recruited Hussman 8 years before on Nail's recommendation, and he'd proved to be a resourceful if superstitious warrior with a great sense for pathfinding. Nail had personally selected him from the individuals in my retinue as muscle for this venture, and I had no quibble with the choice. Hussman was a slender man of medium height with coppery skin and white, sun-scorched hair and goatee. Here on Ichan, like all of us, he'd drabbed down his clothing to ragged black twist robes. He ignored the bundle of disposable wooden forks that Amos had brought back from the commissary and started to eat the hot food from his paper pail with his fingers. I picked at my own food idly, wondering how close we were to Lyco. Lyco had been a fool and had damned himself. The damaging revelation that it hadn't been a Saradon who had been torched on the lawns of the Lang Palace could have been circumvented if Lyco had kept his head. He could have claimed it was a mistake, another example of the heretic Psyker's treachery. But Lyco had run. Out of fear, or chasing some timetable, I didn't know. But he'd run, and in so doing, incriminated himself. I'd gone to his residence, a rented hab, high in the spires of Hive 10, the moment Inchabel had alerted me to the deceit. But Lyco had cleared out, taking his people with him. His hab was empty and abandoned, with just a few scatterings of trash left behind in the stripped rooms. I had set my staff to work tracing him, a tall order given the planet-wide data access problems in the wake of the rioting. I had decided almost at once to pursue him alone, without informing the Inquisition. You may see this as odd, almost reckless. In a way it was. But Lyco was an inquisitor of good repute, held in high regard, and with many friends. There was scant chance I could tell the Ordos I was undertaking a hunt for him on the basis he was harbouring a notorious rogue psyker, without the fact reaching him, or without his friends making trouble for me. Those friends of his, of course, included Haldane and Commodus Voke, the stalwart trio that had captured the 33 rogues on Dulcine in the first place. How empty that heroic action now seemed to me. I had been so impressed when Lord Rawkin had showed me the report. Perhaps the capture had been easy, or even staged, if Lyco was secretly in league with the Saradon. Perhaps it had all been part of an elaborate conspiracy to perpetrate the atrocity of Hive Primaris. I was dogged by grim, unanswerable speculations. I had no way to prove Lyco was corrupt, not even now, though I certainly suspected it. He might have been an unwitting pawn on Dulcine, or at the Lang Palace, or he might have been in it all along. It was possible, too, that his departure from Thracian was a coincidence that I had misinterpreted. It wouldn't have been the first time an Inquisitor had moved undercover without announcement. It was even possible that he, too, had discovered the deceit after the event, and was moving fast following some lead to make amends for his mistake. Or that he was fleeing the shame. Or so many possibilities. I had to play the odds the safest way. I was sure Lyco was guilty to a greater or lesser extent. So I would follow him. Even if he was simply chasing a Saradon too, it would lead me in the right direction. And I couldn't inform the Inquisition, or talk to Voke, or Haldane. My uncertainty was such that I couldn't even trust them not to be part of it. A complex trail of almost subliminal clues had put me on his tail. I'll spare you the bulk of the details, for they would merely document the painstaking tedium that is often the better part of an Inquisitor's work. Suffice to say, we searched and processed Vox logs and the broadcast archives of the local and planetary astropathic guilds. We watched ship transfers, orbital traffic, departure lists, cargo movements. I had personnel in the streets, watching key locations, asking off-the-record questions in trader bars, calling in favours from friends of friends, acquaintances of acquaintances, even one or two old adversaries. I hired trackers and bloodhounders, and took every scent trace I could from Lyco's apartment. I had pheromone codes programmed into servitor skulls that I released into upports and orbital stations. I had well over 100 personnel on my staff, many of them trained hunters, researchers, or surveillancers, but I swear the sheer load of data would have burned out our brains. We would have failed without Amos. My old savant simply rose to the challenge, never put off, never fatigued, his mind soaking in more and more information and making 1,000 mental cross-checks and comparisons every hour, tasks I couldn't have managed in a day with a codifier engine and a datascope. He seemed, damn his old bones, to enjoy it. The clues came in, one by one. A shipment of cargo put into long-term storage in a holding house in Hive 8 and paid for by a debit transfer from one of Lyco's known associates. A 2-second pheromone trace in the departure halls of a commercial port down on the coast at Far Hive Beta. A fuzzy image captured from a Munitorum pict watcher on the streets of Hive Primaris. A passenger on a manifest listing making an unnecessary number of interconnecting flights between upports before moving off-planet, as if trying to lose pursuit. Then the key ones. A cursory excise exam of freight that registered the presence of psi-baffling equipment in an off-world shipment. A series of clumsily disguised and presumably hasty bribes to key longshoremen at the Primaris starport. A rogue trader vessel, the Princeps Amalgam, staying a day longer at high anchor than it had logged permission to do, and then a sudden change in its course plans. Instead of a long run to the Asuridae Reef, it was heading spinwards via Frontsworld to the twist farms of Echan. There was a knock at the room door just after dawn, and I sent everyone except Nail into the adjoining room. Beckwin and Inchabel had the presence of mind to scoop up all the food pails except 2. I went over to the window, and Nail sat down in a chair, with his arm casually over the back, so anyone coming in couldn't see the auto-pistol in his hand. I focused my mind for a moment to make sure our twist disguises were live, and then said, "Enter." The door opened, and the porcupine girl from the twist bar came in. She was dressed in a glistening sap cloak, and she looked at us curiously as she pushed back her hood. "You take your time, Twists," she said.
You got something, Sweet Jean? Or you simply got to check the good stuff you passed on last night?
Nail asked with a lascivious smile. She scowled, and a head crest of spines rose in a threat posture. "I's got a message. You'll know who from."
The Fant?
"I ain't saying, Jean Smudge. I just bring it."
Then spring it.
She reached in her cloak and produced an old, low-tech tracker set, battered and worn. Holding it up briefly, she thumbed it on long enough for us to see the green telltale winking, and then switched it off again and dropped it with a clatter onto the peeling tabletop. "It's gonna be an auction, bidders market, so bring lots of yellow," he says. "Lots of."
Where? When?
"Today at shift 2, in the chew after." "That's to tell you where." "That it?" I asked. "That's all I have. I just bring it." She hesitated at the door. "You might want to make my worthwhile." I put my hand into my coat pocket and pulled out a single, large denomination imperial coin. "You take these?" Her eyes lit up. "I'd take anything." I tossed it over to her, and she caught it with one hand. "Thanks," she said. She went out through the door and then looked back at us, as if my generous contribution to her immediate happiness had shifted her opinion of us, which, sadly, given this miserable place, it probably had. "Don't trust him," she advised, then closed the door and left. The chew-after was the local name given to the tracts of farmland laid waste after the harvesters had been through. Wrecklands of shredded vegetation that began to regrow within days of a harvest, such was the speed and fecundity of Echan's floral growth. At any one time, there were several thousand square kilometers of chew-after in the farmlands round the main hive. We headed south, into the most recent areas of Threshwake, following the signal of the tracker. Noon. That was what she had meant by shift 2. The second shift change of the day. We gave ourselves 2 hours to get there. On top of all my speculations about Lyco, things still didn't add up. It had been easy enough for Nail to identify Fant Mastic as the local slaver, with a specialization in mind jobs, but why was Lyco using him? Why was Lyco selling a Saradon at all? Amos had suggested it was part of a final trade now that a Saradon had completed his part of their pact. That supposed Lyco was in control, which I doubted. And if he was simply cutting the heretic loose now the work was done, why sell him? Why, indeed, come all this way to do that? Inchabel supposed that maybe Lyco was now anxious to get rid of the rogue psyker because he was afraid of him. I had my own theory. Lyco had brought a Saradon to Echan for some other purpose, and arranging a mock sale through the Fant was simply bait to draw anyone who might have followed him out into the open. As it turned out, I was right. I wasn't surprised. It's what I would have done. The chew-after was a miasmal waste, as far as the eye could see, which wasn't far at all given the clinging sap mists from the night before. The land was a gouged, punished ruin of ripped shoots, shredded plant fibre, wrenched-up root balls, and pressure-flattened soil. The massive track marks of the harvesters had left wide ruts, the depth of a man's waist, at the bottom of which plant material and soil was layered into a glassy flatness, like they had been set in aspic. The misty air was wet with sap, and everything was crawling with lice motes and storm bugs. They swarmed in the air, settled all over us, and we could feel them in our clothes. By then, although we maintained our twist disguises, we were all armed and armoured at full strength. One doesn't walk into a likely trap with a black powder pistol and a sharp stick. I wore body armour and carried my power sword and bolt pistol. The others were similarly heavy with battle gear. If we were caught now, maintaining the pretense we were twists would be the last of our problems. 10 kilometres south, through the swirling, sticky mists, we could hear the chugging, rending sounds of the harvesters as they moved on their way. Every few metres there was another bloody smear or furry pulp, the remains of crop rodents caught in the reaping blades of the factory machines. "You'd think," said Inchabel, pausing to wipe the gooey sweat from his face, "that the wildlife would have got used to the farm factories by now, learned to get out of the way."
"Some things never learn," Husman muttered. "Some things always come back to the source." "He means food. He always means food," Nail chuckled to me. "To Dutch, everything comes back to food."
"According to mill statistics," said Amos, "there are 4 billion crop rats in every demi-terre of field space. Rivers of them flee before the harvesters. We've seen 1 rat corpse for every 22 metres, which suggests only 2.2% of them were unlucky enough to be caught in the blades. That means the vast percentage fled. They're smarter than you think." He paused. Everyone had stopped and was staring at him. "What?" he asked. "What? I was only saying—"
"That old geezer fantasizes about maths and stats more than I fantasize about the ladies," Nail told Beckwin as we moved forward again.
"I'm not sure which of you I'm supposed to feel more sorry for," she said. Husman held up the tracker the porcupine girl had given us and shook it. Then he slapped it a couple of times for good measure. We waded through the plant fibre and came level with him. "Problem?" I asked.
"Dumb thing. Too old."
"Let me see it." Husman handed it to me. It was a piece of crap, all right, battered by a lifetime of hard knocks with a nearly flat power cell. A nice touch, that, I thought, noting Lyco's careful planning. An unreliable tracker made this seem so much more genuine. A brand new or well-powered unit would have been as good as a written invitation beginning, "Dear people chasing me, please come here and get killed." I shook the device myself and got a good return, just enough juice to lead us to our deaths. "That way," I said. It was close to noon. The sun was up, but the sap mists hadn't dissipated. We were bathed in a warm, yellow, filmy glare. According to the tracker, we were about half a kilometre away from the auction site. "They're expecting me and Nail, so we'll go in with Beckwin." I wanted an untouchable close to me. "Inchabel, cut east with Amos. Husman, west. Covering positions. Don't move in unless you hear me vox a direct command. Understand?" The 3 nodded. "If you find anything, keep it glossier and keep it brief. Go." Nathan Inchabel armed his las carbine and moved away to the left with Amos, along a harvester track bed, leaving tacky footprints in the glassy, crushed residue at the bottom of the huge rut. Husman's hemp-cloth-wrapped long las was already armed. He darted away to the right, quickly lost in the mist. "Shall we?" I said to Beckwin and Nail.
"After you."
Nail grinned. I made one long-last command by Vox in glossier code, and we trudged into the ripped thickets of the chew-after. The Fant's people had used flamers to clear a wide space in the morass of the chew-over. We could smell the burnt pulp fibre from several dozen metres away. The mist was still close, but I could make out several crop-runner trucks, skimmers and land speeders, parked in the blackened clearing. People bustled around them. "What do you see?" I asked Nail. He played his magnoculars round again.
"Fant and his twist cronies. The horned guy and that eyeball creep. Maybe a dozen, some of whom think they're hidden around the perimeter. plus the prospective buyers. I make 4, all hive types, with minders. 16 other bodies, all told.
I yanked up my hood. Come on.
There's an alarm strand round the site.
We'll trip it. That's what it's there for. The alarm strand was an ankle-high wire cord tied taut between the churned root clumps. Every metre or so, the air-dried shell case of a storm bug was carefully tied to it, forming a little hollow-sounding bell. They rattled and jangled as we deliberately plucked the wire. In a moment, ragged-robed twist muscle loomed out of the murdered undergrowth, aiming matchlocks and blades at us. "We're here for the auction," I told them, holding up Fant's tracker. "S'invited."
"They,"
croaked a frog-headed thing with a crossbow and a spittle problem. "I go, from off, with his twists." Froghead waved us into the sight. The others assembled before the low, flack-board stage on which Fant Mastic stood, looking round at us.
"I go, off-world twist, with 2 others,"
Froghead announced. Fant nodded his heavy, tusked head, and Froghead and his men backed off, putting up their weapons.
"'S glad you could make it twist."
"You the Fant. You the twist with the stuff, but I share my own name loud, not these others."
"Let's all be known, then the sale can begin."
Fant looked down at the other buyers. One, a stunning female upspire hiver, in a tight body glove, nodded. "Fravis Vasek," she said through a panlingual servitor skull drone that floated at her shoulder. She was clearly speaking some high-caste dialect cant, dilettante wealthers, would-be cultist types, well-armed and armoured with all the war gear Spire money could afford.
"Murdoch,"
said the next, a frail, white-suited elderly man, leaning on a cane and wiping perspiration from his brow with a Japananga lace kerchief that had cost more than the lowly Fant's entire outfit. He had 4 minders, squat females in rubberized war arena suits, each with an electronic slave-leash collar around her throat. "Tanselman Fibes," said the bland-faced man to Murdoch's left, stepping forward with a courteous nod. He was dressed in a bright orange cooler suit, with large, articulated exchanger veins sprouting from his shoulders. His breath smoked in the personal veil of cold air the suit was generating around him. He was also alone, which made him instantly more dangerous than the hive retards who had brought muscle.
You may address me as erotic,
said the last, a bitch-faced crone who had inadvisably wedged her ancient body into a close-fitting, spiked black body glove, the mark of a death cultist. Or would-be death cultist, I thought. She had 5 masked and harnessed slaves with her, all of them sweating in the misty heat. I saw at once they were out of their depth. They played at death cult, up in the eyries of the main hive, maybe cutting their skin and drinking blood once in a while. The closest they had come to a real death cult was watching some blurry fake snuff picked to impress their friends after a banquet. "Screech you all. I'm Igor, soft-world, and twisted as they come." I bowed. Fibes and Vasek returned the motion. Murdoch mopped his brow and erotic gestured a very ham-fisted sign of the true death, which nearly made Nail laugh out loud.
"Can we get started, my friend Fant?"
Murdoch asked, dabbing his kerchief around the sweat runs on his face.
"It's midday, and bloody hot out here."
and I have murders to do, and blood to drink,
Erotic cried. Her plump and unhealthy minders oohed and ahed and tried to get their nipple spikes and bondage straps comfortable. "Oh, dear God, Emperor, they're never going to make it out alive," whispered Bequin. "More fool them," I whispered back. Fant's men used force poles and electro-lashes to goad the sale item from the back of a crop-runner truck onto the stage. It was a rangy human, straight-jacketed and blindfolded, with a heavy psychic damper muzzle buckled around his head.
Alpha plus quality, 1 only. Smids, now.
10 bars,
cried Erotic at once. 20, said Vasek.
25,
cried Murdoch. Fibes cleared his throat. His cough blew cold steam out from the private atmosphere generated by his suit.
"I think that's established the common level here. I do hate mixing with proles. 1,000 bars."
Erotic and her minders gasped. Murdoch looked pale. Vasek glanced round at Fibes with a curt look.
At least someone sees the true worth of the item on sale. Good. We can begin serious bidding.
Bassick cleared her throat, and her cyber skull dutifully issued white noise.
1,200 bars, she said.
1,300,
Erotic cried out, desperately.
15, said Murdoch. My best offer. I had no idea this meat would be so hungry. Or so rich.
2,000,
said Vassick's hovering skull.
3,
said Fibes. Murdoch was already shaking his head. Erotic was walking away towards the edge of the site, complaining loudly to her pudgy sex toys, who bustled around her.
3,5, said Vassick.
4,
said Fibes. Anything? I whispered to Bequin. Not even the slightest latent push. But those baffles could be doing their job. So it could be a Ceradon. Yes. I doubt it, but it could. Nail? Harlan Nail looked round at me.
Nothing. The Fance minders are getting edgy because the old witch and her sad hump muffins are trying to leave before the auction's finished. But nothing else.
5, Vassick's servitor skull rasped.
6,
said Fibes. Murdoch had withdrawn to one side of the site with his minders and was taking a sustaining puff of obscura from a portable water pipe one of the War-Arena slave femmes was holding for him. Erotic and her chubby concubines were arguing with Hornhead and another couple of twists on the other side of the burned acre.
8,5,
Vassick was announcing.
9,
returned Fibes. 50, I said quietly, tossing a huge pile of ingots down onto the stained soil. There was a pause. A long, damned pause.
50 bid.
Fant looked down at us all. Murdoch and Erotic and all their people were simply dumbstruck. Vassick turned away, screaming, and her minders had to hold her down as she went into fits of rage. Fibes just looked at me, his breath coming slow and short in clouds.
50, he said.
It's 50. Count 'em. You got better?
What if I have, Igor? Please, stop it with the stupid twist talk. It's getting on my nerves.
Fibes walked towards me. He reached up and pulled his face off. The flesh disintegrated like gossamer as he pulled it away, revealing his blank, piercing eyes.
Oh, Gregor, you do so like to make an entrance, don't you?
Said Cherubael. Chapter 11. Face to face. No witnesses. Death along the line. His was the last face I had expected to see here, though it had been in my mind and my nightmares for nearly 100 years.
It's been a while, hasn't it, Gregor?
The demon host said softly, almost cordially.
I've thought of you often, fondly. You bested me on 56 Izar. I held a grudge for a while, I must admit. But when I learned you had survived after all, I was quite delighted. It meant there would be a chance for us to meet again.
The orange cooler suit began to burn and collapse off him in molten hanks until he was naked. He rose gently, arms by his side, like a dancer, and hovered on the wind a few meters above the churned soil. He was still tall and powerfully made, but the aura that shone from him was more sickly green than the gold I remembered. Unhealthy, bulging veins corded his body, and the numb horns on his brow had grown into short, twisted hooks.
And so we meet again. Aren't you going to say anything?
I could feel Bequin shaking in terror beside me. Stay calm. Stay still, I told her. The demon host glanced at her, and his smile widened.
The untouchable. How wonderful. An almost exact repeat of our first encounter. How are you, my dear?
What do you want? I asked.
Want?
You always want something. On 56 Izar, it was a Necrochuk. Oh, I forgot. You never want anything, do you? You're just a slave, doing another's bidding. Cherubael frowned slightly.
Don't be uncivil, Gregor. You should treasure the fact that I have taken a personal interest in you. Most things that cross me get destroyed very quickly. I could have hunted you out years ago, but I knew there was a bond.
More of your riddles. More nothings. Tell me something real. Tell me about Vogel Passionata. He laughed, an ugly sound.
Oh, you heard about that, did you?
Reports of the incident have made me suspect in the eyes of many.
I know. Bless you, that wasn't my intention. It was just a tiny error on my part. I'm sorry if it's inconvenienced you.
I have no wish to be seen as a man who would form a compact with demons.
I'm sure you haven't. But that is what's happening, whether you like it or not. Destiny, Gregor. Our destinies are entwined in ways you cannot even begin to see. Why else would you dream about me?
Because it has become a central goal of my life to hunt you down and banish you.
Oh, this is a lot more than simple professional obsession. Think, why do you really dream of me? Why do you search for me so diligently, even hiding the extent of that search from your masters?
My mind was racing. This thing knew so much.
And why did I spare you? If it had been you on Vogel Passionata, I would have let you live. I let you live on Thracian.
What?
You stopped to pay homage at Spatian's tomb, and the gate shielded you from the disaster. Why did you stop? You don't know. You can't explain it, can you? It was me, watching over you, planting the suggestion in your mind, making you pause for no reason. We've been working together all along.
No.
You know it, Gregor. You just don't know you know it.
Cherubeo floated away a short distance and looked around. The auction site was frozen, all eyes on him. No one dared move, not even the most weak-willed twist guard. Even those present who didn't know what he was recognized the extraordinary evil and power he represented. "What are you waiting for?" a voice yelled from nearby. Several armed men stepped out of their cover in the chew-after tangles and approached. It was Lyco, with 6 grisly examples of hired muscle.
Look who I found, Lyco. I sprung this trap just like you suggested, to discover if anyone was on your tail. And look who it turned out to be.
"Eisenhorn," Lyco murmured, fear crossing his face for a second. He looked over at Cherubeo. "I said, what are you waiting for? Kill them and we can be gone." It was suddenly clear to me Lyco wasn't the demon host's master. Like Conrad Molitor all those years before, Lyco was another pawn, a corrupted agent of someone, something else.
Must I?
Asked the hovering figure. "Do it! No witnesses!"
Police!
Cried the elderly Murdoch.
We only meant to...
Lyco whipped around and incinerated the old man with his plasma gun. That broke the impasse. Fant's people and the other buyers broke in panic, drawing weapons, shouting. Indiscriminate shooting began. Lyco's gunmen, all ex-military types with autocannons, hosed the staging area and cut down the fleeing twists. I saw Fant Mastic hit by a burst of fire and collapse in rough sections, backwards off the platform. His horn-headed minder ran at Cherubeo, firing a grubby old las pistol. Cherubeo hadn't moved. He was simply watching the murder around him. The las shots sizzled off his skin, and he glanced down at the twist, as if his reverie had been broken. The demon host didn't even move a hand, a finger. There was just a slight nod in the direction of the horned minder, and the miserable twist was somehow filleted where he stood, waves of force stripping off his flesh and popping out his skeleton, parts of it still articulated. I felt the warp churning around that dismal place as Cherubeo went to work. Once he had started, his fury was unstinting. Murdoch's Warina Femmes disappeared in a sudden vortex and died, fused together. The mud beneath Vassic's feet boiled, and she and her bodyguards sank, screaming and thrashing into it. I was frozen, rigid. I felt Bequin pulling at me. Shots seared past my face. I snapped round and saw two of Lyco's men charging us. One dropped suddenly, headshot by what could only have been a sniping round from Hussman out in the torn undergrowth. Nail flew past me and gunned the other down with his Transvasa Parabellum.
Come on, we've got to get out of here,
he yelled at me. There was blood and filth and swirling plant fibre in the air. A warp storm was crackling around us, so dense and dark we could barely see, barely stand against its churning force, but I could make out the glowing shape of Cherubbaal through it all. I drew my power sword and ran towards him. "Gregor, no!" Bequin screamed. I had no choice. I had waited the best part of 100 years. I would not let him go again. He floated around to face me, smiling down.
Put that away, Gregor. Don't worry, I won't kill you. Lyco has no power over me. I'll deal with his complaints later, and...
What? Who does have power over you? Who is your master? Tell me. You caused the atrocity on Thracian, didn't you? Why? On whose orders?
Just go away, Gregor. This is not your concern now. Go away.
I think he was honestly surprised when I hacked the power sword into his chest. I don't really know if I had imagined I could do him any harm. The blessed blade almost disemboweled him before it exploded and hurled me backwards. He looked down in dismay at the wound across his torso. Warp energies, bright and toxic, were spilling out of it. In a second, the wound closed as if it had never been.
You little fool,
said Cherubbaal. I found myself flying backwards through the air, blood in my mouth. The impact of landing shook my bones and smashed the breath out of me. My head swam. The demon host's power had thrown me a good 30 meters across the site, into the underbrush. Furious psychic detonations went off all around. Screaming, semi-sentient winds from the deepest warp snaked around the field, destroying the last of the twists and the fleeing buyers. I tried to rise, but consciousness left me. When I came to, the chew-after was on fire. There was no sign of Cherubbaal. Inchabel and Amos were pulling me to my feet. "Bequin! Nail!" I coughed. "I'll find them," Inchabel said. "Where's Lyco?" I asked Amos, as Inchabel ran off, weapon drawn. "Fled, with his men, in 2 of the land speeders." "And the demon host?" "I don't know. It seemed to just vanish. Maybe it had a displacer field." I started to run back into the site, though my body was burning with pain. Amos cried out after me. Most of the vehicles were smashed or overturned, but a couple were still intact. I scrambled into a small black speeder, a sleek, up-hive sports model that had presumably belonged to Vasek. I cued the thrusters, lifting off before I'd even strapped on the seat harness. The craft was powerful and over-responsive. It took a moment to master the lightness of touch needed to accelerate without sudden blurts of speed. I turned it unsteadily in the air as I climbed too fast above the blasted site. Below, I could see Nail, ragged and bloody, shouting up at me to come back. Banking out of the cone of smoke at 100 meters, I got my bearings. On every side, the acreage of the chew-after spread out until it became lush green cover again. There was the main hive, looming in the distance. Where were they? Where were they? I saw 2 dots in the air, 3 kilometers to the west, and gunned the machine after them. Heavy land speeders, making towards the bulk of the nearest harvester factory. I pushed the turbines to their limit, coming in low and fast behind the slower lift machines. I knew they'd seen me the moment autofire chattered back in my direction, wildly off target. I began to jink, the way Midas had taught me, before they got their aim in. I thought about shooting back at them, but it took both hands on the stick just to keep the sports speeder level. We were passing over green croplands now, an emerald sea that raced away below in an alarming blur. More tracer shots howled back past me. A big shadow passed across the sun. "Want them splashed?" crackled from the Vox. Down jets flaring, the streamlined bulk of my gun cutter settled in beside me, matching my speed. It seemed huge compared to my insignificant little speeder, 150 tons, 80 meters from beak nose to finned tail, landing gear lowered like insect legs. I could see Medea grinning in the cockpit. I daren't lift my hands from the jarring stick to activate the Vox. Instead, I opened my mind directly to hers. "Only if you have to. Try and get them to land." "Ow!" answered the Vox. "Warn me next time you're going to do that." The great bulk of the cutter suddenly surged forward, afterburners incandescent and landing gear raising, and banked away to the right. Its thrust wake wobbled me hard. I watched it turn out in a wide semicircle, low over the crops, furrowing them with its downwash. It looked like a vast bird of prey swooping round for the kill. With its interplanetary thrust tunnels, it easily outstripped the racing speeders, and came in towards them, head on. I felt a surge of psychic power. My enemies had nothing but their minds with which to combat the gun cutter. The cutter suddenly broke left, dipped, and then righted itself. They'd got to Medea, if only for a moment. She was angry now. I could tell that simply from the way she flew. With a wail of braking jets, she turned the cutter on a stall hover as the speeders flashed past. The chin turret crackled, and heavy-gauge munitions tore the second of the two speeders into a shower of flames in the air. Hitting the throttle, I zipped in behind the hovering gun cutter, chasing down the other speeder. "No more," I sent to Medea. "I want them alive if possible." The remaining speeder was close ahead now. I could feel Lyco's mind aboard it. He was closing on the armored bulk of the harvester, which now dominated the landscape ahead. It was a giant, 600 meters long and 90 high at the peak of its humped beetle back. It was kicking a vast wake of sap spray and smoke out behind it. The rattle of its threshing blades was audible above the scream of my speeder's engines. My quarry dipped and flew in along the spine of the huge factory machine, heading for a rear-facing docking hangar raised like a wart on the hull's back. Warning hails were beeping at me over the speeder's Vox set, the alarmed challenges of the harvester. The heavy speeder braked hard and landed badly in the mouth of the docking hangar. Turning in to follow it, I saw figures scrambling out. They disappeared into the hangar, all except one man, who dropped to his knees on the approach slip and began firing back at me with his autocannon. Streams of high-velocity rounds whipped past on either side. Then a bunch of them went into my port intake with a clattering roar that shook the speeder and threw shards of casing out in a belch of sparks. Warning lights lit up across the control board. I dropped 10 meters, put the nose in, and bailed. I broke my left wrist and 4 ribs hitting the top side of the harvester. With hindsight, I was lucky not to have been killed outright, lucky even to have hit the harvester's hull at all. It was a long way down. I managed to grab a stanchion cable as I began to slither down and wrap my right arm around it. My speeder glanced once off the approach slip and bounced up again, tail up, beginning to tear apart. Trailing debris, the machine cartwheeled in, vaporizing the gunman, hit Lyco's parked land speeder and shunted it right into the hangar, which exploded a second later in a sheet of fire and metal. I limped along the approach slip, sidestepping chunks of burning wreckage, and climbed over the smashed, smouldering speeders into the hangar. Impact klaxons were rasping out, and automatic firefighting sprays were still squirting out dribbles of retardant foam. At the back of the hangar, a hatch was half open, next to the cages of the service and cargo elevators. I pushed through the hatch. A metal staircase descended into the factory. At the bottom, it opened out into a companionway that ran the length of the harvester. Stunned work crews, most of them twists in sap-stained overalls, gazed at me. I produced my rosette. "Imperial Inquisition! Where did they go?" "Who?" "Where did they go?" I snarled, enforcing my will without restraint. The effect was so powerful, none of them could speak, and several passed out. All the others pointed down the companionway towards the head of the factory. Another hatch, another staircase. The noise of the internal threshers was now shudderingly loud. I came down into the vast internal work line, a long chamber that ran the length of the harvester. It was a huge, deafening place, the air thick with sap mist. A massive processing conveyor carried the harvested produce along from the reaping blades of the harvester's mouth at a rate of several tons every second. Twist workers in masks and aprons worked the front part of the line with chain tools and cutting lances, which were attached to overhead power systems by thick, rubber-trunked hoses. They sorted and cut the larger sections of root and stalk before the crop went through the great vicing rollers and stamping presses into the macerating vats further down the factory. With the alarms sounding and warning lights flashing, the line had come to a halt, and the workers were looking around, liquid cellulose and sap dripping off their gauntlets, overalls, and work tools. I blundered through them, overseers shouting at me from gantry stations far above. I could see Lyco 30 meters away down the line, pushing through with one last gunman and a bound, visored figure that could only be a Saradon. The gunman turned and fired at me down the length of the line vault. 3 workers crumpled, one spilling over onto the belt. The shots spanged sparks off the metal walkways and machinery. As the other workers dived for cover, I dropped to my knee and reached for my bolt gun. It wasn't there. In fact, the entire holster was ripped open. I wasn't sure when I lost it, during Cherubael's assault or slamming off the hull of the harvester, but it was long gone, and my beloved power sword had been disintegrated on contact with the demon host. More shots whizzed down the work line and dented the metal facings of the belt drivers. I crawled into cover behind a drum of hydrobac tool wash. I pulled my backup weapon from the ankle holster built into the side of my boot. It was a compact, short-frame auto with a muzzle so short it barely extended beyond the trigger guard. The hand grip was actually longer than the barrel and contained a slide magazine of 20 small-caliber rounds. Selecting single fire, I cracked off a couple of shots. The aim was lousy and the power poor. It really was meant to be a close-range last-ditch. The gunman down the line, undeterred by my pathetic display, switched over to full auto and raked the deck area and working space beside the stationary belt. Workers, all pressing themselves into cover, began to scream and yell. The shooting stopped. I dared to look out. There was a clunk and a whir, and the conveyor started moving again. The gunman was following his departing master again. Lyco was almost out of sight, pushing his captive ahead of him. Was Saradon a captive, I wondered. I still didn't understand the relationship between Lyco, the Psyker, and Cherubael. I ran on. The gunman, Lyco, and his captive Psyker had all disappeared through a bulkhead door. To follow them, I'd have to go in blind. And if I'd been in Lyco's place, I'd have used the bulkhead as a point to turn and wait. My gut readings of his actions had not been wrong so far. I leapt up onto the wide conveyor belt, ignoring the shouts of the cowering work crew, and slithered across it through the matted, sticky crop load. The sap and the moving belt made it nigh on impossible to stay upright. For a moment, I thought I might slip and be carried along under the nearest roller press. I leapt off the far side onto the solid deck, dripping with green mush and vegetal fluid. Now I was following the work line down the other side of the wide conveyor, which divided the harvester centrally. There was a bulkhead door on this side, too. I went through it, low. The gunman was waiting behind the other door on the far side of the moving belt. He saw me, cursed, and turned with his autocannon. I was firing already. Even at this shorter range, the pathetic stopping power of my auto was evident. His drum-barreled autocannon was about to roar out my doom. I dived headlong, thumbing my weapon to auto, and ripped off the entire clip of small slugs in a shrill, high-pitched chatter. What I lacked in power, I made up for in numbers. I hit him 6 or 7 times in the left arm and collar, and staggered him backwards, his bonded armor torn open. The heavy cannon flew out of his hands and landed on the moving belt between us to be carried out of view. He was far from dead, though he was bleeding profusely from the multiple small-caliber grazes and impacts. He was probably glanding some stim that kept his edge. Snarling an oath, he drew a military-issue las pistol from his webbing and climbed up on the work-line footrail on his side of the rolling belt to get a better angle on me. I threw the empty gun at him and made him duck, and then grabbed one of the hose-suspended work lances hanging by the line edge. He got off a shot that barely missed my shoulder. I swung the lance at him, the chain blade tip chittering, reaching out across the belt, but it was hard to manipulate it with one wrist smashed. So I turned the swing into a throw and launched the long tool like a harpoon. The chain tip impaled him, and he died still screaming and trying to drag the industrial cutter from his chest. As he went limp, the tension in the rubberized power hose pulled the lance back towards its rest hook on my side of the line, dragging the body onto the conveyor. The belt carried it along as far as the hose would allow, and then it stuck fast, the belt moving under it. Piles of wet plant fibre began damming up against it and spilling over onto the floor. "Eisenhorn," a voice said in my mind. I wheeled round and saw Lyco standing on a grilled gantry that formed a walk bridge over the belt. The plasma gun he had used to burn the faker Saradon was aimed at me. I could see the battered psyker, his head still masked and visored, lashed to a wall pipe on the far side of the line. "You should have left well alone, Eisenhorn. You should have never come after me." I'm doing my job, you bastard. What were you doing?
What had to be done? What needs to be done?
He came down the walk bridge and stepped towards me. There was a hunted, terrified look in his face. And what needs to be done? Silence. Why, Lyco? The atrocity on Thracian. How could you have allowed that? Been part of it?
I didn't know what they were going to do.
Who? He squashed my cheek with the muzzle of his potent weapon.
No more,
he said, speaking for the first time. If you're going to kill me, just do it. I'm surprised you haven't already.
I need to know something first. Who knows? Who knows what you know?
About you and your little pact with the demon scum? About your theft of an Alpha-plus class psyker? That you stood by while millions died on Thracian? Ha!
Everyone.
I added the answer psychically for emphasis.
Everyone. I informed Rorken and Orsini himself before I left on your trail.
No. There would have been more than just you after me.
There is.
You're lying. You're alone.
You're doomed.
He stormed his mind into mine, frantic to tear the truth out of me. I think he was truly realizing how far into damnation he had cast himself. I blocked his feverish mind assault and countered, driving an auger of psychic rage into his hindbrain. It was in there. I could feel it. His true master. The face. The name. He realized what I was doing, realized that I outclassed him psychically. He tried to shoot me with his plasma gun, but by then I had shut down his nervous system and blocked all autonomous function. I scoured his mind. He was frozen, helpless, unable to stop me ransacking his memory, despite the blocks and engram locks he had placed there. Or someone had. There. There. The answer. He uttered an agonized, oddly modulated scream. Lyco tumbled away from me. Cherubael hovered above us, high in the roof space of the factory chamber, casting a glow of filthy warp light. Choking, twitching, his limbs limp, Lyco was rising up towards him. Smoke was coming out of his mouth and nostrils.
Now, Gregor, Cherubael said. Nice try, but there are some secrets that must remain.
With a nod of his head, he tossed Lyco aside. The traitor Inquisitor flew down to the front of the factory space, bounced hard off the inner hull, and then fell down into the churning reaper blades in the factory harvester's maw. His body was utterly disintegrated. Cherubael hovered lower, grabbed the comatose, bound form of a Saradon like a child picking up a doll.
I won't forget what you did,
said the demon host, looking back at me one last time.
You'll have to make it up to me.
Then he was gone, and a Saradon was gone with him. Chapter 12. At Cadia, by Terce. The Pylons. Talking with Neve. A bitter autumn wind was coming down off the moors,